Chapter 2038. The Imperial God. Yi Xian had already guessed the middle-aged man's identity. Just as he'd expected, the middle-aged man had sensed how extraordinary the green profound sword was. Meanwhile, the middle-aged man gazed at Yi Xian and grinned. "Young man, you're very smart. Just like that person from before." Yi Xian's brows knit together slightly. "That person from before?" The middle-aged man nodded. "The person who came before you." Yi Xian spoke in a low voice. "He noticed you as well?" The middle-aged man nodded. "But he left." Yi Xian was quite curious. "How strong is he?" The middle-aged man gazed at Yi Xian and smiled. "You don't mind if I tell you the truth, right?" Yi Xian was about to speak when God I spoke abruptly. "Of course." Yi Xian felt a slight headache when he heard this. Meanwhile, the middle-aged man said, "He's much stronger than the two of you." God I's face froze. "So he intends to compare the two of us." Yi Xian smiled. "Senior, have you given your inheritance to him?" The middle-aged man shook his head. "No." Yi Xian blinked. "Do you think he's not suitable? If that's the case, then just look at us. I think we're quite suitable. Do you want to consider us?" The middle-aged man's face froze. God I pulled on Yi Xian's sleeve. "Brother Yi, isn't that too direct?" Yi Xian spoke seriously. "What's direct about it? Most of the time you have to fight for things yourself. You want face, and if others don't, then you'll lose half the battle. It's just like pursuing a beauty. If you don't pursue her, then someone else will. That person might succeed, but you'll never be able to." As he spoke, he gazed at the Imperial God and smiled. "If Senior gives it to us, then we'll make a huge profit. If you don't, then I won't lose anything. What do you think?" God I hesitated for a moment before he said, "It seems to make sense." "Ah." The nearby Imperial God suddenly started laughing. "Little fellow, you're right. If I was as shameless as you all those years ago, then perhaps I wouldn't have missed the person I loved." Yi Xian smiled and said, "Senior's strength is unparalleled in the past and unmatched in the future. Would there be any woman who would reject Senior?" The Imperial God shook his head and smiled. "Many times feelings can't be measured by other things." Yi Xian nodded. "That's true." The Imperial God sized up Yi Xian and said with a smile, "Are the two of you here for my inheritance?" Just as God's eye was about to nod, Yi Xian suddenly said, "Actually, that's not entirely true. Our main reason for coming here is to meet Senior. One must know that although Senior has left our era for a very long time, the legends of Senior have always been passed down in our era. Perhaps Senior doesn't know, but outside, we cultivators all look up to Senior as a role model, hoping that one day we can have Senior's achievements. Unfortunately, for countless years, no one has been able to reach the level of embodiment transformation." God's eye looked at Yi Xian. The Imperial God suddenly burst into laughter. After laughing for a while, he said, "Little fellow, you're really interesting. Your mouth is really powerful. Although I know you're just flattering me, I have to say that I feel very comfortable." At this point, he paused slightly and said, "Actually, I didn't leave this projection here to leave behind an inheritance. Because to reach the level of embodiment transformation, you can only rely on yourself. The so-called inheritance might even become a kind of restriction for others. Do you understand what I mean?" Yi Xian said in a deep voice, "Embodiment transformation, you can only rely on yourself, right?" The Imperial God nodded. Yi Xian was a little curious. "Then why did Senior leave this projection here?" The Imperial God smiled and said, "To meet the people and geniuses of the future." I have to say, it still somewhat shocked me. Yi Xian smiled embarrassedly. "The two of us actually aren't that outstanding." The Imperial God was slightly stunned, then he smiled and said, "Little fellow, you misunderstood." "Yes. I was shocked because of that person who came just now." Yi Xian's face darkened. "Damn it, you didn't finish speaking and made me misunderstand. How boring." God's eye was slightly embarrassed as well. He was already a little afraid of being together with Yi Xian. Meanwhile, the Imperial God said, "Actually, you shocked me as well." Yi Xian was about to speak when the Imperial God said, "I'm talking about your sword." Yi Xian's face froze. "Damn it, I finally know why you missed out on the person you love. Who can stand it if you keep talking like this?" Meanwhile, the Imperial God looked at Yi Xian and said with a smile, "Actually, you're not bad as well. You've probably concealed a lot of your strength. However, you're a little flashy and lack focus. If you can focus a little more, then your accomplishments should be even higher." Yi Xian pondered deeply for a moment, then he bowed slightly and said, "Thank you for your guidance, Senior." The Imperial God smiled. "It can't be considered guidance." As he spoke, he looked at the green profound sword in Yi Xian's hand and said softly, The owner of your sword? I can't compare to him. Qinghe. Yi Xian glanced at the green profound sword in his hand and fell silent. Obviously, the imperial god had sensed something from the green profound sword. Meanwhile, God's Eye suddenly said, "Senior, did you give your inheritance to that defying one?" The imperial god smiled, "I wanted to, but he didn't want it." God's Eye frowned slightly. "He didn't want it?" The imperial god nodded. "He's a very outstanding person. You're from the same generation as him, so I'm afraid." He didn't continue when he spoke up to this point. God's Eye had obviously understood what the imperial god meant, and his expression was calm. No one knew what he was thinking. Yi Xian suddenly asked, "Why didn't he want it?" The imperial god smiled. "He said he can reach the free form on his own, and doesn't need anyone's help." Yi Xian narrowed his eyes. "So his main purpose here isn't your inheritance, or he just wants to see the legendary free-form expert? Or maybe there's something else in this place that interests him?" A trace of surprise flashed in the imperial god's eyes. "Little guy, I'm very surprised by your intelligence." Yi Xian asked in a low voice. "He has another purpose?" The imperial god nodded. "There's something in this place that I used for cultivation in the past, and his purpose here is for that. Little guy, can you guess what it is?" Yi Xian fell silent for a moment, then said, "He doesn't want the inheritance and probably doesn't care about the divine object. What he wants should be something like a spiritual vein. After all, no matter how monstrous or talented a person is, if he doesn't have cultivation resources, he's useless." The imperial god smiled. "You guessed it." As he spoke, he sized up Yi Xian and then he said, "I have to say you really shocked me." Obviously he admired Yi Xian a little. Yi Xian smiled and then he said, "Senior, can you tell me what it is?" The imperial god fell silent for a moment and then he said, "It's a star vein. A star vein formed from the condensation of millions of star domains, and it contains extremely terrifying star divine energy, and it's sufficient for him to cultivate to the free-form realm." Yi Xian frowned slightly. "Millions of star domains?" The imperial god nodded. "After I reached the peak of the Daoming realm, I noticed that the spiritual energy in this universe wasn't enough for me to continue cultivating, so I thought of a way, and that was to gather star energy." When he spoke up to here, he shook his head and smiled. "I spent nearly 1,000,000 years to gather enough star energy, and it was really tiring." 1,000,000 years. Even though the imperial god was only at the Daoming realm all those years ago, could he have been an ordinary Daoming realm expert? Obviously not. Even with his strength, he'd still spent over 1,000,000 years. When he thought up to here, Yi Xian said softly in his heart, "Looks like I have to ask Qinghe to get one for me when I have the time. It's too tiring for me to get one myself." Xiaotao was speechless. Yi Xian looked at the imperial god and smiled. "Senior, we'll be taking our leave." As he spoke, he looked at God Eye. "Let's go." God Eye was slightly puzzled. Is Yi Xian going to give up on the imperial god's inheritance just like that? Yi Xian didn't loosen the reins only to grasp better, and he directly left with God Eye. Meanwhile, the imperial god suddenly said, "Little fellow, are you interested in accepting my inheritance?" Yi Xian stopped and he turned to look at the imperial god with a smile. "Senior, can I speak the truth?" The imperial god was slightly stunned and then he smiled. "Of course." Yi Xian smiled. "Actually, I was just joking with Senior. I didn't come here for the so-called inheritance. After all." As he spoke, he gazed at the green profound sword in his hand and said, "If I need an inheritance, isn't the owner of this sword enough?" The imperial god's face froze when he heard this. However, Yi Xian felt extremely good in his heart. "Damn it, that's what you get for insulting me." Yi Xian continued, "However, I feel that there's someone who's very suitable for Senior's inheritance." The imperial god gazed at God Eye and didn't speak. Yi Xian smiled. "Senior, may I be so bold as to ask if that defying one was born in the same era as you? Who do you think is more outstanding between you and him?" The imperial god roared with laughter, and his laughter was filled with confidence. Geniuses were all very confident. Moreover, he had the qualifications to be confident. After all, he'd already attained the free transformation realm while the defying one hadn't. Yi Xian looked at God Eye. "I don't think he's inferior to the defying one." The imperial god smiled. "Why?" Yi Xian thought for a moment, and then he said, "Senior, can you guarantee that you'll be able to meet someone more outstanding than him in the future?" The meaning behind his words was that the defying one didn't want your inheritance and I didn't want it either, so who else could you give it to? If you don't give it to me, then I'll continue waiting until the end of time. Sure enough, the imperial god fell silent. He valued the defying one the most, but the defying one didn't want it. After he met Yi Xian, he'd become interested in Yi Xian as well. Even though Yi Xian wasn't as monstrous as the Defying One, Yi Xian really suited his taste. Unfortunately, Yi Xian didn't want it as well. So only God Eye remained. The Imperial God gazed at God Eye. Meanwhile, Yi Xian hurriedly sent a voice transmission to God Eye. Kneel. God Eye was slightly stunned, and he asked in his heart. What? Yi Xian's face darkened. Take him as your master directly. Quickly. God Eye hesitated for a moment. But I already have a master. Yi Xian said seriously, an inheritor is different from a master. You're just inheriting his inheritance and bringing it to greater heights. So you're still Senior Mu Ji's disciple, and you're just an inheritor to this senior. Of course you can take him as your master as well. It doesn't matter if you have one more master, the important thing is that you respect both of them. Besides that, why did Senior Mugu ask you to come here? Isn't it for the sake of his inheritance? If you obtain this senior's inheritance, then your master will definitely be happier than you are. God Eye thought for a moment and said, but he hasn't said that he wants to take me as his disciple. Yi Xian's face darkened. He'll definitely take you as his master if you kneel. God Eye hesitated for a moment before he said, how awkward would it be if he doesn't take me as his disciple after I kneel? Yi Xian said seriously, so long as you don't feel awkward, then it'll be others who feel awkward. Understand? God Eye thought for a moment and then he knelt down with a thump. Master. Yi Xian's face darkened. Big brother, you should kneel to him, not to me. Xiao Ta was speechless. P.S. Asking for tickets. Chapter 2039. He knelt to the wrong person. God Eye was slightly embarrassed and he hurriedly turned to face the Imperial God. Master. He kowtowed heavily as he spoke. The Imperial God looked at God Eye in silence for a long time before he said, my inheritance might be able to help you, but it might also be able to restrict you. Do you understand what I mean? God Eye shook his head. No. Yi Xian felt a headache coming on. The Imperial God's expression froze, but he quickly smiled. If you understand, then you understand. If you don't understand, then you don't understand. That's good. He opened his palm as he spoke, and a spatial ring slowly floated to God Eye. My inheritance is in this spatial ring. God Eye looked at the Imperial God and said seriously, I will do my best to bring glory to Master's teachings, and I will definitely not disgrace Master. The Imperial God smiled, all right. He glanced at Yi Xian as he spoke and then he asked, are the two of you friends? God Eye replied, we're from the same sect. The Imperial God smiled, then we're friends. He looked at God Eye and smiled, your friend isn't bad, you should listen to his opinion in the future. God Eye glanced at Yi Xian and then he nodded, all right. The Imperial God chuckled, and then he glanced at the green profound sword in Yi Xian's hand before he slowly closed his eyes, and he gradually vanished. God Eye stood up and said softly, has Master already fallen? Yi Xian shook his head, I don't know. God Eye looked at the spatial ring in his hand, and then he looked at Yi Xian, why don't you want this inheritance? Yi Xian smiled, I'm a swordsman and I have my own path of the sword to walk. He was an entrant, and his path was different from the others, so the Imperial God's inheritance was more like a restriction to him. God Eye nodded, thank you. Yi Xian smiled, what are you thanking me for? God Eye spoke solemnly, I know he thinks more highly of you. If you nod, this inheritance is yours. Yi Xian smiled and said, do you still remember what I told you at the beginning? God's Eye looked at Yi Xian. Yi Xian smiled and said, believe in yourself. You are not inferior to anyone. The God Eye was silent. Meanwhile, the horizon in the distance suddenly trembled violently. In the next moment, all the spirit energy in the core of the world actually surged towards that direction like a tide. Yi Xian said softly, looks like the Defying Ones found the star vein. God Eye nodded. Shall we go take a look? Yi Xian laughed and said, of course. With that, the two of them disappeared on the spot. Not long after, Yi Xian and God Eye arrived at the depths of a mountain range. In the air above the mountain range stood a man. The man was very young and he wore a simple gown. His hair was tied into a bundle behind his head, and he looked extremely simple. Below the man there was a huge abyssal crack. Within that abyssal crack, one could vaguely see countless starry blue lights. The power of the stars. Extremely dense power of the stars. The man's gaze was fixed on the crack below, and he didn't even spare a glance at Yi Xian and God Eye. Yi Xian sized the man up and was slightly curious. Is this the Defying Ones? Meanwhile, the crack below grew larger and larger. At the same time, An enormous star vein slowly floated up from the depths of the ground. At this moment, the entire core of the world started to tremble violently. The man looked down with a calm expression. God, I suddenly said, what about Destiny's Child? Yi Xian glanced at the surroundings and smiled. He should be here by now. God, I looked at Yi Xian. He's here? Yi Xian nodded. God, I hesitated for a moment and asked, Brother Yi, how did you know? Yi Xian was quite speechless. Of course it was a guess. Does Destiny's Child have anywhere else to go? Of course not. Right at this moment, the ground below split apart completely, and the star vein slowly floated up. Meanwhile, the space not too far away from the defying ones had suddenly split apart, and then a man walked out slowly. The man wore a white robe, had his hands behind his back and had a calm smile on his face. Destiny's Child. Yi Xian sized Destiny's Child up. This fellow seems like an expert, but I wonder how strong he is. The defying ones glanced at Destiny's Child and withdrew his gaze. He looked at the star vein below him, and then he opened his palm and a white jade bottle appeared there. Right when he was about to take the star vein, it resisted violently and floated towards Destiny's Child. Obviously, it wanted to choose Destiny's Child. The defying ones gazed at Destiny's Child and the latter smiled. The star vein has a spirit and wants to follow me. The defying ones put away the jade bottle and walked slowly towards Destiny's Child. Right at this moment, the space above him suddenly split apart. In the next moment, a thick layer of clouds appeared above him, and then countless bolts of divine lightning flickered within them. Warning. This wasn't a warning from Destiny, it was a warning from the unseen Destiny. A wisp of surprise flashed through Yi Xian's eyes when he saw this. Xiao Ta, this fellow seems quite interesting. Xiao Ta said, this fellow should be similar to a Dimension's child. Yi Xian was slightly puzzled. A Dimension's child? Xiao Ta explained, to put it simply, it means that he's very formidable. No one can go against him, and anyone who goes against him is equivalent to going against the heavens. Understand? Yi Xian thought for a moment and said, so, he's even more formidable than the one with the halo? Xiao Ta said with disdain, a Dimension's child without the halo is trash. He's equivalent to an emperor without military power. He looks formidable but he's actually useless. Yi Xian nodded, I understand. Xiao Ta, you're quite useful sometimes. Xiao Ta was speechless. Meanwhile, the Defiant suddenly stopped moving, and then he raised his head to look at the black clouds in the sky. He flicked his thumb lightly and a ray of white light shot into the sky. Bang! The ray of white light shot into the clouds. In an instant, the clouds exploded apart, and countless bolts of divine lightning were instantly transformed into nothingness. They'd been forcefully wiped out. God's Eye, who stood by Yi Xian's side, instantly revealed a solemn expression when he witnessed this scene. Brother Yi, this fellow is quite ferocious. Can you even defeat him? Yi Xian nodded, it shouldn't be a problem. Meanwhile, the Defiant suddenly stopped moving, and then he turned around to look at Yi Xian with a calm expression, but his fists were clenched tightly. Yi Xian's eyelids twitched slightly. Is this fellow going to do something to me? Right at this moment, the Defiant suddenly turned around to look at Destiny's Child, and then he suddenly smashed his fist forward. It was a very simple punch. With this punch, the entire core world became illusory, and the space and time around Destiny's Child began to be annihilated at this moment. However, nothing happened to Destiny's Child at all, because he wasn't in that expanse of space anymore. However, he just arrived at the next expanse of space when that expanse of space started to be swiftly obliterated. Moreover, he had no choice but to immediately enter the next expanse of space. A strange scene appeared here. Destiny's Child was ceaselessly leaping through space, but every single time he leaped through space, that expanse of space would be obliterated. Yi Xian and God's Eye's expressions became solemn once more when they witnessed this scene. Both of them were ferocious. Meanwhile, the Defiant suddenly placed his right palm against the center of his forehead, and then he gently sliced forward. All of this caused countless expanse of space to split apart, and the speed at which he sliced was even faster than Destiny's Child could leap through space. Destiny's Child's pupils suddenly constricted. He spread open his right hand, pressed his fingers together and tapped forward. At this moment, a powerful force swept out from the tip of his finger. In an instant, boundless and merciless energy converged towards the tip of his finger from countless expanses of space. This finger had the help of all the worlds in the universe. Yi Xian and God's Eye glanced at each other when they saw this. Needless to say, Destiny's Child does have some ability. At this time, when the Defying One cut open the space in front of Destiny's Child, he directly punched. Fight head-on. using his own strength to fight against the power of the heavens and the 10,000 worlds. Under the watchful eyes of Yi Xian and God's eye, a fist and a finger touched each other. In an instant, boom. The spacetime around Destiny's Child burned and turned into ashes. Not only that, but Destiny's Child's body was also retreating. It wasn't an ordinary retreat, he was retreating through countless spacetimes. Every time he retreated, that spacetime would be destroyed. That punch from the Defying Ones was too powerful. Destiny's Child's expression gradually turned grave. Right at this moment, his finger actually started to burn slowly as well. At the same time, the formidable energy at the tip of his finger started to disperse as well. Moreover, the countless worlds he couldn't see started to burn as well. This punch wasn't only aimed at Destiny's Child, but also at the 10,000 worlds that were helping him. Yi Xian and God's Eye glanced at each other, and God's Eye's expression became extremely grave. Brother Yi, it seems like I really can't beat him. Later. Do I still have to fight? Yi Xian was speechless. In the distance, Destiny's Child suddenly stomped his right foot. Boom. Wherever his foot landed, that spacetime turned into nothingness. At this moment, the space between Destiny's Child's eyebrows suddenly split open. The next moment, a red light burst out from between his eyebrows. The red light blasted towards the space between the Defying One's eyebrows. The moment the powerful red light appeared, everything around them turned into nothingness. It couldn't withstand the powerful power of the red light at all. Yi Xian took a deep look at the red light. This red light could probably kill some telekinesis realm experts. At this moment, the Defying Ones raised his left hand and smashed down with his elbow. Without any fancy moves, it was just a simple smash. Boom. With this smash, the red light was actually forcibly smashed into pieces. Destiny's Child's pupils constricted when he witnessed this scene. He was just about to attack again when the Defying One suddenly took a step forward. In the next moment, he grabbed Destiny's Child's throat with a single hand. Defeat. The surroundings suddenly fell silent. However, it didn't take long for the surrounding spacetime to tremble, and then strands of mysterious energy suddenly enveloped the Defying Ones. This wasn't a power that belonged to Destiny's Child. God's Eye spoke softly by Yi Xian's side. This is the legendary energy of destiny. Has that ethereal destiny acted? Chapter 2040. Fate? Yi Xian frowned. His intuition told him that something was wrong. What was fate? It was a legendary and illusory existence that controlled everything in the world. Up until now, the only ones who dared to say that they could control their own fate were Qing-Er, his father, and his big brother. Although Destiny's Child was powerful, he probably had nothing to do with the real fate. Of course, the premise was that fate was a spirit with self-awareness. Thinking of this, he felt a headache. What kind of existence was fate? In fact, he couldn't figure it out. You could say that it didn't exist, but was the birth, aging, sickness, and death of all living things really a coincidence? Definitely not. All of this had a pattern, and if there was a pattern, it could be man-made. Even if it wasn't a human, it must be some form of living thing. If you said it existed, no one could tell what it was. Yi Xian looked into the distance and stopped thinking about this problem. Wouldn't he know if he had the chance to ask Qing-Er in the future? In the distance, the Defying Walker stopped and looked around. At this moment, the spacetime around him was densely packed with mysterious forces. These mysterious forces were like a huge net that enveloped him. The Defying Walker frowned. He suddenly opened his left hand and an invisible force quietly gathered in his palm. The next moment, his left hand swept in all directions. Boom. With this sweep, the surrounding mysterious forces were swept away. Not only that, but the spacetime within hundreds of thousands of miles actually fluctuated like a wave. It was extremely shocking. Seeing this scene, Destiny's Child, whose throat was grabbed by the Defying Walker, turned gloomy. You dare to fight against fate. The Defying Walker slowly clenched his left hand and then put it behind him. He shook his head slightly. You can't represent fate. This shouldn't be the true power of fate. Fate is mysterious because it is everywhere, but it is never there. Moreover, cultivators, from the moment they start cultivating, they are fighting against Tao and fate. Those who don't fight are either incompetent or dead. With that, he loosened his left hand and turned to walk down the star vein. Destiny's Child was stunned. You won't kill me? The Defying Walker shook his head. You don't have the qualifications for me to kill you. Destiny's Child's face instantly turned ugly. This sentence made him feel worse than killing him. This was a humiliation. No, this was a direct disregard. As the #1 monstrous genius of the Saint bloodline, he shouldn't be compared with the Defying Ones. Between him and the Defying Ones, who was the most monstrous genius in the great Mo Heaven domain. He had always wanted to fight a defying being. In his opinion, there was no one in the younger generation who was a match for him. However, the cruel reality was that he was no match for this defying being. The other party disdained to kill him. Next to Yi Xian, God Eye said in a low voice, "Will there be a problem with his mentality?" Yi Xian glanced at Destiny's Child. If this is his first failure, then there will definitely be a problem. This kind of person has never experienced the cruel beatings of society. Once they encounter failure, they will deny themselves and then go to a dead end. As he spoke, he shook his head and sighed. It was impossible for outsiders to dissuade him on this matter. Otherwise, the other party might bear a grudge against him. God Eye suddenly asked, "Brother Yi, have you ever been beaten by society?" Yi Xian said seriously, "How could that be? I have always been invincible. Especially the younger generation, there is no one who can match up to me." God Eye. At this time, the defying being had already put the star vein into his storage ring. His goal was this star vein. After collecting the star vein, he was about to leave. However, he seemed to have thought of something and turned to look at God Eye. "I heard that your God Eye is not ordinary. Can you let me see it?" God Eye was silent. Yi Xian pulled God Eye's sleeve. "Don't be afraid. Get him." God Eye nodded slightly. He walked towards the defying being and slowly closed his eyes. In the next moment he suddenly opened his eyes. The moment he opened his eyes, 2 blood-red lights shot out from his eyes. As the 2 blood-red lights appeared, the space-time in front of him turned into nothingness. In the distance, the defying being spread out his right hand and pressed it forward. Boom. An invisible force forcefully blocked the 2 blood-red lights. Under the obstruction of this invisible force, the 2 blood-red lights couldn't advance even an inch. At this moment, God Eye suddenly roared in rage. 2 terrifying blood-red lights burst out from his eyes again. At this moment, the 2 blood-red lights were like scorching suns, and the entire core world started to melt. Yi Xian was shocked. This God Eye is not bad. In the distance, when the 2 blood-red lights blasted towards the defying being, the powerful force directly blasted the defying being thousands of meters away. After the defying being stopped, he pointed forward with his fingers and punched again. Boom. The 2 blood-red lights were directly turned into nothingness. God Eye's entire body was sent flying, but it wasn't long before a hand caught him. It was Yi Xian's hand. Yi Xian looked at God Eye. God Eye's eyes were slightly closed, and 2 streams of blood flowed slowly from the corners of his eyes. Yi Xian asked in a deep voice, "Are you all right?" God Eye shook his head slightly, "Just a little weak." Yi Xian nodded, "It's good that you're fine." Meanwhile, the defying being spoke abruptly, "God Eye. You still can't utilize the full strength of your eyes. Didn't you obtain the inheritance of the Imperial God? I'll come look for you in a few days. I hope you'll be able to give me a pleasant surprise then." As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and left. Meanwhile, God Eye spoke abruptly, "You can fight Brother Yi. He's very strong as well." Yi Xian was speechless. The defying being stopped, and then he turned around to gaze at Yi Xian in silence. God Eye pulled on Yi Xian's arm. "Brother Yi, get him." Yi Xian hesitated for a moment and said, "First, Destiny's Child fought him and then you fought him. Now I'm going to fight him as well. Wouldn't others say that we're taking turns fighting him?" God Eye thought for a moment and said, "That seems to be the case." Yi Xian was about to speak when the defying being spoke abruptly, "No." Yi Xian gazed at the defying being and the defying being said, "I didn't use any strength to fight them just now. You don't have to feel guilty about fighting me." God Eye, who stood by Yi Xian's side, hurriedly said, "Get him." Yi Xian smiled and then he stood up and walked towards the defying being. "How about this? We'll decide the outcome with a single move. What do you think?" The defying being gazed at Yi Xian. "All right." Yi Xian opened his palm, and the green profound sword appeared in his grasp. He gazed at the defying being and smiled. "No one has been able to take a single attack from me until now. I hope you don't disappoint me." The defying being nodded slightly. "I know you're trying to provoke me. However, I'm still willing to take a single attack from you. I hope you don't disappoint me. I'll kill you if you disappoint me." Yi Xian was quite puzzled. "Why?" The defying being gazed at Yi Xian. "Even though they lost to me, they weren't flashy at all. On the other hand, you've been flashy since the beginning. I hate flashy people who aren't strong." Yi Xian roared with laughter. "Then I'll attack." The defying being nodded. "Bring it on." Yi Xian suddenly took a step forward and flicked his left thumb. Bang! In the blink of an eye, under the astonished gazes of Destiny's Child and God's Eye, the Defying One had silently retreated 30 kilometers away, and as soon as he stopped, the space behind him had been reduced to ashes. Moreover, the Defying Being's right hand had actually split apart, and it split all the way down to his shoulder. Both God Eye and Destiny's Child were stunned when they witnessed this scene. Is that attack so ferocious? Meanwhile, Yi Xian put the green profound sword away, and then he gazed at the Defying Being and smiled. That's it? That's it? The expressions of both God Eye and Destiny's Child froze when they heard this. The Defying Being who stood before Yi Xian fell silent for a moment, and then he gazed at Yi Xian. I was careless. As he spoke, his gaze descended onto the green profound sword in Yi Xian's hand. I underestimated the sword in your hand even more. Yi Xian grinned, and then he turned around and walked towards God Eye. Meanwhile, the Defying Being spoke abruptly. Is it over? Yi Xian stopped moving and then he turned around to look at the Defying Being. I only utilized 30% of my strength just now. If I used my full strength then you would be dead. Do you know that? The Defying Being gazed at Yi Xian in silence. Yi Xian spoke seriously. You seem to not believe me? The Defying Being nodded. Now you can utilize your full strength. However, Yi Xian shook his head. Not now. The Defying Being frowned slightly. Why? Yi Xian smiled. What do you think of my attack just now? The Defying Being thought for a moment and then he said, it's very strong. Even though he hadn't utilized his full strength just now, needless to say, Yi Xian's attack was very strong indeed. After all, if he hadn't utilized his full strength just now, then Yi Xian's attack might have been able to kill him. Especially when Yi Xian's aura and sword energy had actually suppressed him. That was the most surprising to the Defying Being. After all, even Destiny's Child hadn't been able to suppress him when he utilized the energy of the world. In the distance, Yi Xian suddenly smiled and said, with our strengths, it's impossible to determine a victor in a short period of time. Why don't we set a time and fight again? At that time we can determine a victor. What do you think? The Defying Being frowned slightly. Set a time? Yi Xian nodded. Why don't we do it 3 months from now? We'll fight again in 3 months. The Defying Being gazed at Yi Xian. Are you sure? I have to tell you that I might have reached another level in 3 months. Yi Xian smiled. It's fine. If you think it's not enough, then I can give you a few more months. The Defying Being frowned slightly. Are you that confident? Yi Xian roared with laughter. It's not that I'm confident, but I hope that my opponent is very strong. A person who hopes that his opponent is weak is definitely a weakling himself. So, I hope that my opponent is strong, the stronger the better. In any case, I'm invincible, so do whatever you want. Everyone was speechless. Chapter 2041. God's Eye and Destiny's Child's expressions became strange when they heard Yi Xian's words. Invincible? Is this fellow really invincible? Even though Yi Xian is very strong in their opinion, it's a bit too much to say that he's invincible. The Defying One gazed at Yi Xian and didn't say anything. He felt a headache coming on as well. Isn't the outcome of the battle still undecided? Why does it seem like I've already lost? How depressing. In the distance, Yi Xian walked over to God's Eye and smiled. Let's go. Destiny's Child hesitated for a moment before he said, Brother Yi, that star vein? Yi Xian turned to glance at the Defying One and smiled. I'll give that star vein to you. Remember, you owe me a favor. Destiny's Child was speechless. The Defying One frowned slightly. It seems like it was. Yi Xian suddenly said, We'll meet again. As soon as he finished speaking, he vanished on the spot with God's Eye. The Defying One frowned even more. Destiny's Child hesitated for a moment before he turned around and left as well. The Defying One fell silent for a moment before he said, What the hell? At this moment, an old man appeared beside the Defying One. It was the Devil Bloodline's master, Gu Qin. Gu Qin looked at the Defying One and said softly, Why didn't you kill them? The Defying One fell silent for a moment before he said, I won't fight for a moment. Gu Qin was slightly stunned when he heard this, but a wisp of a smile quickly appeared on his face. Won't fight for a moment. Even though he hoped that the Defying One would kill Destiny's Child and the other two, he felt very gratified when he heard the Defying One's answer. What? Because the Defying One's goal wasn't a temporary victory, but a future grand Tao. As if he'd thought of something, Gu Qin suddenly said, What do you think of that swordsman just now? The Defying One fell silent for a moment before he said, I don't know if he only used 30% of his strength in that attack. Gu Qin asked, What if he really only used 30% of his strength? Defying Walker said softly, That sword is very strong, but the key is still that sword. That sword can tear apart my retrograde power? After a moment of silence, Guqin said, when did the Saint bloodline accept such a monster? At this moment, the Defying One looked at the storage ring in his hand. I'm going into seclusion for a period of time. I'll go find him in 3 months. With that, he turned around and disappeared. Guqin turned around to take a look and sighed in his heart. The inheritance of the free transformation realm expert. He already knew that the inheritance of the embodiment transformation powerhouse had fallen into the hands of the Saint bloodline. Needless to say, this was a pity, but when he thought of the Defying Ones, he felt relieved. Avatar transformation? It was only a matter of time before the Defying Ones reached embodiment transformation. A moment later, Guqin left. Saint bloodline inside the main hall. Yi Xian, Destiny's Child, and God's Eye stood in the main hall. In front of them were the 3 gods of peace. The few of them had been paying attention to the core all this time. Therefore, they knew everything that was happening inside. All 3 of them looked at Yi Xian. It has to be said that all 3 of them had mixed feelings. Originally, they thought that Destiny's Child could be on par with the Defying Ones, but they were disappointed. Destiny's Child was directly beaten up by the Defying Ones. It was a real beating. If not for Yi Xian standing up, the Saint bloodline would have lost all face. At this time, the Saint bloodline's leader, Su Chong, suddenly looked at Destiny's Child and smiled. You've been dealt a blow? Destiny's Child was silent. Su Chong sighed softly. If this small blow makes you deny yourself and become unable to recover, then you will be abandoned by fate. Do you understand? Destiny's Child nodded. Su Chong continued, as a man, losing isn't scary. What's scary is not having the courage to start again. Destiny's Child looked at Su Chong. Master, don't worry, I won't give up. Su Chong nodded. That's good. Saying so, he looked at Yi Xian and smiled. I have to say, you've surprised us all. Yi Xian smiled. Leader, I have a small question. Su Chong nodded. Speak. Yi Xian said, there's actually a world underground? Su Chong spoke softly. Not to mention you even were quite surprised. I just don't know if that world was created by the Imperial God or if it has existed since the beginning. Yi Xian spoke in a low voice. Is there a difference? Su Chong smiled. If it was created by the Imperial God, then that world wouldn't be so mysterious. If that world was before the Imperial God. He didn't continue speaking when he spoke up to this point. Yi Xian understood when he heard this. If that world was before the Imperial God, then it meant that it might have been created by someone. Moreover, the core of the world wasn't simple. He'd felt how terrifying the gravity was when he went down there, so how much gravity would it take to create a world underground? In other words, the Imperial God wasn't the first expert to attain free transformation. Meanwhile, Su Chong spoke abruptly. Based on the current situation, the strength of the Defying One isn't inferior to a thought-transcendent realm expert. If he improves further, then even a thought-transcendent realm expert would be no match for him. Once he improves further, then the current situation in the Great Machin region will be instantly destroyed, and will be suppressed by the devil veins or even destroyed. The expressions of everyone in the hall became slightly solemn when they heard this. The current ratio of the saint veins to the devil veins was 40 to 60, and the reason was because of the Defying One. But if the Defying One improved further, then it wouldn't be 40 to 60 anymore. A single person could really turn the entire situation around. Right at this moment, Su Chong suddenly looked at Yi Xian. Yi Xian's eyelids twitched. Leader? Why are you looking at me? Su Chong walked slowly over to Yi Xian and spoke in a low voice. Little fellow, the fate of the Saint Veins is in your hands. Yi Xian shook his head and smiled. Leader, don't joke with me. Su Chong turned to look at Mu Shen. Mu Shen fell silent for a moment before she said, What can we give him? A trace of surprise flashed through Yi Xian's eyes. This woman sees things very clearly. What can the Saint Veins give you? Does he have feelings for the Saint Veins? Of course not. He was different from Shun Tong and Destiny's Child. He hadn't relied on the resources of the Saint Veins since he started cultivating. On the contrary, he had even helped the Saint Veins turn the tables. Of course, his goal was also very simple. He wanted to experience all kinds of experts and use them to train himself. But he had never thought of getting involved in the feud between the Saint Veins and the Devil Veins. Risking his life for the Saint Veins? He wasn't a fool. At this moment, Su Chong looked at Yi Xian. What do you want? Yi Xian smiled. Or should I say, what can the Saint Veins give me? Su Chong said in a low voice, Cultivation resources. We can provide you with an endless supply of cultivation resources. Yi Xian fell silent. To be honest, he really did lack cultivation resources now. At his current cultivation realm, every time he cultivated, he required an enormous amount of spirit energy. Even though he had a lot of infinite crystals, it wasn't enough for him to cultivate in Xiaota's body for a few days. Meanwhile, Mugu spoke abruptly, "It isn't just cultivation resources. We can provide you with numerous special cultivation methods as well. It's even to the extent that the three of us can train with you. Besides that, we'll ask many old fellows to study your problems and suggest ways to improve them. In short, we can serve you in all aspects and allow you to attain your own limits." Yi Xian looked at Mugu. "Can we do that?" Mugu nodded, "Yes." Yi Xian looked at God Mu, and God Mu nodded slightly. "The Saint Veins have been passed down for so many years, and we have many unique cultivation methods. Of course, we know that you're a swordsman and have your own unique path of the sword Tao. We won't force you to learn from us. We can only support you and help you reach your own limits." Yi Xian thought for a moment and then he said, "I can give it a try." Truthfully speaking, he wanted to improve himself to his limits. Even though he'd only exchanged a single blow with the Defying One, he'd noticed that he was still lacking in many areas. He hadn't utilized the energy of his bloodline during that attack, and he'd merely utilized his imposing aura and sword energy. However, he'd gained an advantage because he'd utilized the green profound sword. Moreover, the Defying One had underestimated him. If the Defying One hadn't underestimated him at all, then he might not have been able to tear the Defying One's hand apart. Meanwhile, Su Chong spoke abruptly, "We don't have much time, so we'll start targeted training for you now. Our Saint Veins will do our best to help you defeat the Defying One in the competition 3 months from now." As he spoke, he glanced at Mugu. The latter understood his intentions, and then he opened his palm and a command token flew out from within it. In the blink of an eye, 3 black-robed old men appeared here. Su Chong gazed at Yi Xian. "Let's start with the battle. The core of that attack you executed against the Defying One was your imposing aura and sword energy, right?" Yi Xian nodded, "Yes." Su Chong turned to look at the 3 old men beside him. "These 3 are our Saint Bloodline's Grand Elders. They are Elder Mu, Elder Shin and Elder Qiu. From now on, the 3 of them will be training you." Yi Xian looked at them and bowed slightly, "Thank you." Elder Mu glanced at Yi Xian. "Do you know how many types of energy there are?" Yi Xian shook his head. Elder Mu spoke in a low voice, "At least a few hundred." Yi Xian was speechless. Elder Mu continued, "You mainly focus on imposing aura and sword energy. You've practically reached your limits in these 2 types of energy. Now we suggest that you borrow energy." Yi Xian frowned slightly. "Borrow energy?" Elder Mu nodded. "Your own energy has a limit in the end. But if you borrow energy, then you'll be able to temporarily break through that limit. Borrow the energy of time and space, borrow the energy of the heavens. If the time is right, you can even borrow external energy to allow yourself to break through again." Yi Xian spoke in a low voice, "How do I borrow energy?" Elder Mu smiled, "That's very simple." Yi Xian was slightly stunned, "Very simple?" Elder Mu nodded, "Our Saint Veins have been passed down for so many years. Naturally, we have a lot of cultivation methods and divine abilities." As he spoke, he looked at Su Chong. "Leader, I want to use all the resources in the sect." Su Chong smiled, "Sure. From now on, all the resources in the sect are at your disposal. Not only that, everyone has to cooperate with you, including me." A moment later, the entire Saint Veins began to move. Chapter 2042. The Saint Bloodline had no choice but to help Yi Xian improve. If Yi Xian was unable to defeat the Defying Ones, then the Saint Bloodline would be completely suppressed, and that would be extremely fatal to the Saint Bloodline. As for Yi Xian, he needed someone to help him find out what he was lacking. He was walking on a completely new path, and while others couldn't help him in terms of the direction of the Grand Tao, they could help him in the details. In the following period of time, Yi Xian started to learn how to take advantage of the Grand Tao. Actually, his method of taking advantage of the Grand Tao was similar to how Destiny's Child had summoned all the worlds in the universe to help him. However, the difference was that Destiny's Child had his own core, which was his own aura and sword energy. On the other hand, Destiny's Child completely relied on the energy of the universe. Once the Defying Ones destroyed the energy of the universe, Destiny's Child was like a wolf without fangs, and he could only wait to be slaughtered. Yi Xian sat cross-legged in the starry sky, and the 3 supreme elders weren't too far away from him. Elder Mu said, "The Grand Tao scripture that we passed down to you just now is a mental cultivation technique of our Saint Bloodline to condense force. It's ranked 2nd in our Saint Bloodline, so you have to fully comprehend it now." Yi Xian frowned slightly. Second? What about the first? Elder Mu hesitated for a moment before he said, "It's not that we don't want to pass it down to you, but I'm afraid you can't cultivate it." Yi Xian was slightly puzzled. Why? Elder Mu said solemnly, "Because the first mental cultivation technique has an extremely harsh requirement. When you condense force, you have to travel through space, not just 1 or 2 layers of space but countless layers. Under such circumstances, it's very difficult for you to succeed. Even if you succeed, it'll probably take half a month to condense it once. Travel through space." Yi Xian said solemnly, "To borrow the power of the universe, you have to travel through countless layers of space, right?" Elder Mu nodded. "The Grand Tao scripture is a bit simpler. Of course, it's much less useful because it can only allow you to borrow the power of the nearby worlds. In fact, these 2 mental cultivation methods were created by the same person. The reason why that senior created this mental cultivation method was because the previous mental cultivation method had too harsh requirements for the cultivator. Normal people can't cultivate it at all. Therefore he created this great Tao canon." Yi Xian smiled and said, "Give me the first-rank mental cultivation method." Elder Mu hesitated for a moment before saying, "This? I'm afraid that after you cultivate it, you won't be able to use it, which will be a waste of time." Yi Xian smiled and said, "It's fine, give it to me. Ignore space and time." With the Qingshen sword, wouldn't he be able to ignore any space-time? Elder Mu glanced at Yi Xian and did not refuse. He pointed a finger and a white light entered the space between Yi Xian's brows. Boom. In an instant, countless pieces of information surged into Yi Xian's mind. The divine techniques of the Great Tao. This was a mental cultivation method for gathering power. It had to be said that it was a bit terrifying. According to the description, after cultivating it, one could instantly gather the power of the heavens and 10,000 worlds. However, it was very harsh. Firstly, the user had to be able to ignore the space-time barriers of the heavens and 10,000 worlds. The reason that Senior had been able to create this cultivation method was mainly because he had the space-time divine physique. He couldn't ignore space-time, but he could merge with many different space-times. On the other hand, Yi Xian could completely ignore space-time, and it was even more terrifying than this space-time physique. In the following period of time, Yi Xian started to study this great Tao canon. With the help of Elder Mu and the others, his speed could be said to have improved by leaps and bounds. 10 days later, Yi Xian started to gather power. Yi Xian closed his eyes slightly in the starry sky. After a long time of silence, he suddenly opened his eyes. "Come." As soon as he spoke, the space-time of countless planes started to tremble violently. Immediately after that, strands of extremely terrifying power surged out from the space-time around Yi Xian, and they converged like a river into the Qingshen sword in Yi Xian's hand. Boundless power. The expressions of Elder Mu and the others became solemn when they witnessed this scene. The speed at which this power was gathered was too swift. The divine elder who stood by Elder Mu's side gazed at the Qingshen sword in Yi Xian's hand. Will this sword be able to endure it? Elder Mu glanced at the Qingshen sword in Yi Xian's hand, and then he said, "It should be fine." In the starry sky, the Qingshen sword began to tremble slightly. Beside him, the starry sky around him began to boil at this moment. Not only that, but there was also an endless amount of momentum surging towards Yi Xian from all directions. At this moment, the momentum contained in Yi Xian's Qingshen sword had reached an extremely terrifying level. Yi Xian pressed his thumb lightly against the hilt of the Qingshen sword. His eyes were still slightly closed and he didn't attack. He wanted to see his limits. It wasn't long before he noticed that he had no limits at all. Or it should be said that the Qingshen sword had no limits. The power surged into the Qingshen sword like a river flowing into an ocean. The corners of Yi Xian's mouth curled up slightly when he noticed this. He was using the Qingshen sword as a vessel to condense his power. In other words, so long as the Qingshen sword could endure it, then there would be no limit to the amount of power he could gather. The size of the Qingshen sword's vessel was determined by the amount of power he could gather. The current situation was that the Qingshen sword had no limit. Meanwhile, the starry sky suddenly seethed violently, and then countless strands of starlight were obliterated. The expressions of Elder Mu and the others had changed. At this moment, all of them felt that they were in danger. Meanwhile, the space around Yi Xian had started to burn and be obliterated. This expanse of space wasn't able to endure the power that he'd borrowed. Meanwhile, Elder Mu hesitated for a moment and said, "You still haven't reached your limit?" "Limit?" Yi Xian gazed at Elder Mu and smiled, "I've only just begun." Elder Mu was speechless. Meanwhile, Elder Chiu suddenly said, "You can't borrow any more." Yi Xian was quite puzzled. Why? Elder Qiu spoke solemnly, if you continue, then it'll harm the quintessence of many worlds. Yi Xian sensed for a moment. Sure enough, it was just as Elder Qiu had said. If he continued, then he would really harm the quintessence of those worlds. Yi Xian issued a command in his heart and was about to sever his connection with those worlds. However, the Divine Elder suddenly said, wait. Yi Xian gazed at the Divine Elder while the Divine Elder stared at Yi Xian. You can sense the energy of all the worlds in the universe right now, and then analyze the differences between them, your own energy and your sword energy. In the end, see if you can fuse them perfectly and form a new type of energy. Yi Xian was stunned when he heard this. Right. What's my true objective? I hope to rely on this energy to improve myself. When he thought up to this point, Yi Xian slowly closed his eyes, and then he comprehended the boundless energy. How is this energy different from my own energy? It didn't take long for Yi Xian to notice a core point, and it was that his energy was very simple. Both his own energy and sword energy were very simple, and they didn't contain any other energy. However, the energy of all the worlds in the universe was different. It was all-encompassing and wasn't a single entity, yet it was condensed into a whole. Fuse. Yi Xian fell silent for a moment, and then he started to fuse the energy of all the worlds in the universe into one with his own energy. However, he noticed that it was very difficult. It was very difficult for two completely different types of energy to fuse. Meanwhile, the Divine Elder suddenly said, is it difficult? Yi Xian nodded. The Divine Elder fell silent for a moment before he said, you can try to fuse with them instead of making them fuse with you. Yi Xian was slightly stunned. That's possible? The Divine Elder said, give it a try. Yi Xian thought for a moment, and then he started to try to fuse his energy and sword energy with the energy of all the worlds in the universe. He noticed that when his energy and sword energy took the initiative to fuse with the energy of all the worlds in the universe, the energy of all the worlds in the universe actually didn't reject him and allowed him to fuse with it. Yi Xian gazed at the Divine Elder with a puzzled gaze. The Divine Elder pondered deeply for a moment before he said, all the worlds in the universe can accommodate everything, and it can accommodate you as well. However, you can't accommodate all the worlds in the universe. It's like how an ocean can accommodate a river, but can a river accommodate a river? Yi Xian fell silent. The Divine Elder continued, after being in contact with you for the past few days, the three of us have noticed that your sword Dao is very special. It isn't a normal way of breaking through the Dao. Your sword Dao is very different and we've never seen it before. He paused for a moment before he continued, however, all the grand Daos in the world lead to the same destination. We'll give you a suggestion. In the process of cultivation, don't focus too much on yourself. You can also try to come into contact with heaven and earth. That defying one is equivalent to going against the heavens. The path he takes is the complete opposite of most cultivators. His cultivation method is countless times more difficult than ordinary people. Of course, his strength is also countless times stronger than ordinary people. Yi Xian suddenly said, Senior, you want me to obey the Tendo? The Divine Elder hesitated for a moment before he nodded. I know you might be a little disgusted. After all, most capable people like to go against heaven. Moreover, obeying the Tendo will make you feel like you're submitting to the Tendo. Yi Xian hurriedly shook his head. No. Senior, you've misunderstood. I don't feel that way. Tendo? He naturally didn't dislike the Tendo. What a joke, Sister Nian was a 5-dimensional Tendo. The Divine Elder was stunned. Yi Xian said seriously, as far as I know, many Tendo are very good. More often than not, some living beings like to stir up trouble and go against heaven. I personally hate this kind of people. Most Tendo will do anything, but many living beings like to go against heaven when they have nothing better to do. That kind of people have nothing better to do. As soon as he finished speaking, the green profound sword in Yi Xian's hand suddenly trembled. In the next moment, the endless power in the green profound sword gushed out and surged into Yi Xian's body. Boom. In an instant, Yi Xian's power reached its peak, and the Divine Elder and the other two in front of him were directly sent tens of thousands of feet away. Not only that, from the vast starry sky, countless stars surged towards Yi Xian like a wave. Yi Xian was stunned at first. In the next moment, he hurriedly raised his sword towards the sky. I, Yi Xian, am willing to die with the Tendo. Oh no, I will live and die with the Tendo. Live and die together. The Divine Elder and the other two. Someone asked me what I would do if I suddenly had 100 million. I thought about it for a long time and I think I would still write books. After all, writing books is my hobby. What meaning would there be in life? I write not for money. Chapter 2043. Hearing Yi Xian's words, Divine Elder and the other two were dumbfounded. Why is this guy so smart? Of course, most importantly, they didn't expect that the Tendo would respond to Yi Xian. What does this mean? It means that the Tendo approves of Yi Xian. Does flattery work on the Tendo? The three of them looked at each other with a trace of disbelief in their eyes. At this moment Yi Xian's lips curled up slightly. There was a huge difference between possessing the Qingxian sword and possessing Yi Xian. This was because the heavenly ways of the myriad realms had acknowledged Yi Xian. In the beginning, when he cultivated the great Tao scripture, it was equivalent to borrowing the force of the heavens. Perhaps the heaven Tao was very strong in the eyes of the people of the mortal world, but in the eyes of experts at their level, an ordinary heaven Tao was actually nothing. So, if he wanted to borrow power, then the heaven Taos of the myriad of worlds wouldn't dare refuse. But things were different now. The great path of the universe had acknowledged Yi Xian, and it had taken the initiative to help him. There was an essential difference. Of course, what Yi Xian did not know was that everything had its causes and effects. If you borrowed something, you would have to return it. At this moment, Yi Xian opened his palm and pressed it down lightly. In an instant, the force disappeared. He didn't choose to test it with his sword because he was afraid that it could destroy the great Motion territory. At this moment, Divine Elder said in a deep voice, "You surprised us." Yi Xian looked at Divine Elder and smiled. "Senior, what should we cultivate next?" Divine Elder glanced at Yi Xian and said, "You don't seem to be afraid of the Defying One." Yi Xian asked, "Why should I be afraid?" Divine Elder looked at Yi Xian for a while and smiled. "Indeed, the Defying One is nothing. Let's practice actual combat." As soon as he finished speaking, he looked at Elder Qiu, and the latter nodded slightly. Elder Qiu opened his palm, and a small crystal cube appeared in his hand. Yi Xian was a little curious. "This is?" Elder Qiu said, "This is an independent illusory world, and it's made up of countless formations. It's perfect for actual combat training." Yi Xian smiled and said, "Just as well." With that, the four of them entered the Rubik's Cube. Within the world of the magic cube, Yi Xian looked around. The world around him was indeed an illusion. In other words, he could recklessly destroy it. Yi Xian looked at the three elders and asked, "Seniors, who is my opponent?" The Divine Elder looked at Yi Xian, "Us." Yi Xian was slightly stunned, and then he said, "The three of you?" The Divine Elder nodded. "You have to fight 1 against 3. Yi Xian smiled and said, "All right." As soon as he finished speaking, he opened his palm and the green profound sword in his hand flew out. He did it without hesitation. The moment the sword flew out, the Divine Elder suddenly vanished on the spot. The next moment, the sword was directly grabbed by a huge illusory hand. At the same time, a fist appeared in front of Yi Xian's forehead. Yi Xian's pupils constricted, and with a thought, countless sword chi flew out from his body. Bang! A wave of sword light shattered, and Yi Xian instantly retreated tens of thousands of meters away. But before he could stop, a fist slammed into his chest. Bang! In an instant Yi Xian's body collapsed, and only his soul was left. Yi Xian was stunned. In the distance, the Divine Elder looked at Yi Xian. "Do you think we're very weak?" Yi Xian smiled sheepishly. "No. It's just that I didn't expect the three of you to be at the telekinesis realm as well." The Divine Elder nodded. "When we were at the telekinesis realm, Su Chong and the others were as young as you." Yi Xian was speechless. Meanwhile, Elder Qiu spoke in a low voice. "We don't know exactly how strong the Defying One is, but we're sure that he's hidden his strength very well, and he might even have attained the telekinesis realm a long time ago." Elder Qiu added, "Perhaps he has attained the Tao Illumination realm." Tao Illumination. Elder Mu and the Divine Elder fell silent when they heard this. Actually, they didn't want to think in that direction. Elder Qiu gazed at Yi Xian. "Little fellow, how did you feel when you faced him? Speak the truth and don't use fancy words." Yi Xian thought for a moment and said, "Unfathomable." "Unfathomable." Elder Qiu said, "You didn't feel that way when you faced the three of us, right?" Yi Xian nodded. Hearing this, the expressions of the three turned grave. A short while later, Elder Qiu sighed softly. "Little fellow, if you don't want to get involved in this, then we won't stop you. You can leave. We're not playing hard to get, nor are we trying to goad you into action." The Divine Elder and Elder Mu gazed at Elder Qiu. Elder Qiu glanced at Yi Xian with a complicated expression. "He's an extraordinary genius. If he fights the Defying One now, then it's very likely that he'll die prematurely. Our Saint bloodline shouldn't trick him like that." A trace of surprise flashed through Yi Xian's eyes when he heard this. He hadn't expected the old geezer to think in that way. Elder Mu and the Divine Elder fell silent. Elder Chiu gazed at Yi Xian. You decide. Yi Xian smiled. Fight. Elder Chiu gazed at Yi Xian. Why? Yi Xian roared with laughter. Because I want to see if I'm inferior to anyone in the younger generation. It wasn't his problem if the older generation was stronger than him, but if the younger generation was stronger than him as well, then it was his own problem. He never thought that he was the best among the younger generation, but he didn't think that he was inferior to anyone either. He could have let the 3 old men bring him into the Xiao Ta to cultivate. If he cultivated in the Xiao Ta, he was confident that he could kill any Dao Ming realm expert after 3 months. However, he didn't choose to do so. This time he wanted a fair fight because the Defying One was upright and above board. Yi Xian had his own pride. If you play dirty, then I'll play dirty. If you're upright and above board, then I won't be a villain. Yi Xian could lose in terms of strength, but he would never lose in terms of character. Hearing Yi Xian's words, Elder Chiu nodded slightly. Then let's continue. In the following time, after Yi Xian reconstructed his body, he continued to fight with the 3 old men. If it was just one of them, he wouldn't feel any fear. However, it was 1 against 3. He was completely suppressed and couldn't fight back at all. The 3 of them were the pinnacle experts of the great Mo Heaven domain. Especially when the 3 of them joined forces, they didn't give Yi Xian any chance at all. Of course, he had also improved. That was, he didn't dare to fight head-on anymore. Instead, he learned to pull. As he fought and pulled, he didn't get beaten up so badly. In front of a hall, God Eye looked at the void and frowned slightly. No one knew what he was thinking. At this moment, Destiny's Child appeared beside him. Destiny's Child looked up at the sky. He can't beat the Defying One. God Eye looked at Destiny's Child. Why? Destiny's Child said softly, because when I fought with the Defying One, I could feel that he hid most of his strength that day. Compared to him, we are indeed much weaker. God Eye smiled. Brother Mingtai, I think something is wrong with your thinking. Destiny's Child looked at God Eye. What's wrong with my thinking? God Eye said softly, I also lost to the Defying One that day, but I never thought that I was weaker than him. Destiny's Child looked at God Eye. Why? God Eye said with a smile, I admit that he is indeed strong, but I will never deny myself again. If we can't beat him now, does that mean we can't beat him for the rest of our lives? If we deny ourselves in our hearts and think that we can't beat him, then we will be inferior to him for the rest of our lives. Destiny's Child was silent. At this moment, God Eye looked up at the void. I think that Brother Yi can definitely beat the Defying One. Destiny's Child glanced at God Eye. What makes you think so? God Eye said softly, Brother Yi said that he has never been defeated. Destiny's Child frowned slightly. You believe him? God Eye nodded. Of course. Destiny's Child frowned even deeper. What makes you believe him? God Eye thought for a moment, then said, I think that a genius like Brother Yi would definitely disdain to lie. He said that he has been invincible all along, and I believe that this is definitely true. As he said that, he looked at Destiny's Child. He injured that Defying One with 1 slash before. Do you think this kind of peerless swordsman would disdain to lie? Destiny's Child was silent. God Eye continued, In the beginning I also thought that Brother Yi was flashy, but later I realized that the world only saw the flashy side of Brother Yi, but did not see his inner wisdom. Look at me, I followed him and got the inheritance of a free transformation realm powerhouse for nothing. If I continue to follow him, there will definitely be more benefits in the future. I will definitely befriend this brother of mine. Destiny's Child looked at God Eye. You, awesome. God Eye looked at Destiny's Child. Brother Mingtai, why don't you follow Brother Yi too? I think that you have quite a future. Destiny's Child shook his head. I won't follow anyone. After saying that, he turned and left. God Eye shook his head. Is it embarrassing to follow someone else? At this moment, the sky in the distance suddenly tore open, and the next moment, a man slowly walked out. When he saw the person, God Eye's expression instantly became serious. The person was the Defying One. At this moment, Su Chong and the others also appeared in the sky. Su Chong looked at the Defying One. It seems like it's not time yet. The Defying One nodded. I know. Su Chong frowned slightly. Then what are you doing here? The Defying One said, I have broken through and I am bored, so I came here to wait for him. Hearing this, the expressions of Su Chong and the others instantly became serious. Broken through? This fellow has broken through? This was not the main point was what this fellow had broken through. Is it the telekinesis realm or the Daoming realm? At this moment, the Defying One looked up at the sky. He still hasn't broken through? Su Chong and the others fell silent. At this moment, the three of them had slightly ugly expressions. The defying one retracted his gaze and said, "Then I will wait for him." Su Chong looked at the defying one. "Aren't you afraid that we will kill you here?" The defying one glanced at Su Chong. "In this great Machin region, no one can kill me." Chapter 2044. Su Chong and the others frowned when they heard the defying being. No one can kill him? Needless to say, the defying being was quite arrogant. But if they thought about it from another perspective, was the defying being really arrogant? The expressions of Su Chong and the others gradually turned solemn. Even though they wanted to crush the defying being right now, they didn't attack. Because they weren't confident in their ability to do so. Not to mention the defying being's own strength, the devil heritage expert was hiding in the shadows as well. If they attacked right now, then it would be a life and death struggle for them. But it hadn't come to that yet. Because the Saint bloodline experts had a final trump card, and it was Yi Xian. When they thought about Yi Xian, they couldn't help but glance up into the sky. Could Yi Xian really defeat the defying being? Actually, they weren't very confident because the defying being was too heaven-defying. Even someone as strong as the Child of Destiny was like an ant before him. As for the flashy Yi Xian. Suddenly, a sword howl resounded through the sky, and then the sky split apart. In the blink of an eye, Yi Xian appeared here. Xu Wang frowned slightly when he saw Yi Xian. "You?" Yi Xian grinned. "Leader, I'm too embarrassed to make others wait for me for so long." Xu Wang gazed at Yi Xian. "Be careful." Yi Xian nodded, and then he gazed at the defying being and smiled. "I never expected that you would arrive so quickly." The defying being sized up Yi Xian and then he said, "You can continue cultivating. We agreed on a time of 3 months. Only 5 or 6 days have passed now, so I can wait for you." Yi Xian smiled. "There's no need to wait. Let's begin right now." The defying being nodded. "All right." Yi Xian said, "Are we going to fight here?" Xu Wang's face darkened. "Do you want to destroy our Saint bloodline?" Yi Xian was speechless. Xu Wang raised his head and looked at the distant horizon. "Guqin, as far as I know, there's a mysterious outer world in your devil vein. This world is empty and perfect for battles, right?" At this time an old man walked out. It was the master of the demonic vein, Guqin. Guqin glanced at Yi Xian, then opened his palm, and an ancient painting appeared in his hand. Su Wang looked at Guqin. "I believe that this is a fair battle. Leader Gu will not play any tricks, right?" The defying one said abruptly, "Don't worry, Void Pulse Master. Just as you said, this is a fair battle and no one will play tricks." Xu Wang nodded. "That's good." With that he looked at Yi Xian. "Be careful." Yi Xian laughed and said, "Of course." As he spoke, he entered the outer world with the defying one. The outerverse world was an endless void. Everything here was composed of array formations. It was similar to the magic cube world from before, but this world was much larger and much more solid. After the two entered the outer world, the Divine Elder and the other two appeared beside Xu Wang and the other two. Xu Wang said in a low voice, "Are you confident?" The Divine Elder shook his head. "I don't know." Xu Wang looked at the Divine Elder. "I don't know." The Divine Elder nodded. "We can't see through him." Xu Wang smiled faintly. "It's good that you can't see through him." Everyone looked at the outer world. Opposite Yi Xian, the defying one looked at Yi Xian. "I hope you can give me a pleasant surprise." Yi Xian laughed. "I hope you aren't too weak." Who didn't know how to show off? The defying one nodded. "Then let's begin." As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly took a step forward. As soon as he took that step, Yi Xian felt his vision blurred. Countless worlds flashed before his eyes like sparks flying off a flint. Yi Xian's pupils constricted. The defying one intended to use dimensions to suppress him. Moreover, the defying one was already a few tens of thousands of layers of space in an instant. If Qinshi couldn't enter the same space as the defying one, then Qinshi would be in an absolutely disadvantageous position. Yi Xian didn't choose to jump through space. Instead, he pushed up lightly with his thumb. The sword in his sheath suddenly flew out. An extremely ear-piercing sound of something tearing resounded. In an instant, a bottomless rift had appeared in the space in front of Yi Xian. This strike contained his own imposing aura. Meanwhile, the defying one stopped. In the next moment, he and Yi Xian retreated explosively at the same time, and they only stopped after moving almost 3 kilometers back. After the defying one stopped, he glanced at the sword in Yi Xian's hand. "Why aren't you using that sword from that day?" The sword Yi Xian was using now wasn't the green profound sword. Yi Xian smiled. Swordsman. What's important is the person, not the sword. In my hand, even a piece of wood is a peerless divine sword. Xiao Ta, the defying one, looked at Yi Xian. I think there's a difference. If you were to use that divine sword, I would be more fearful. But the sword in your hand, forgive me for being blunt, I'm afraid it's difficult for it to harm me. Yi Xian smiled. Again. The defying one nodded. As soon as he nodded, the sword in Yi Xian's hand suddenly disappeared. As soon as the sword was unleashed, the entire outer world boiled. Imposing aura and sword momentum. Probing? Neither of them chose to test the waters. Once they started fighting, they immediately went all out. At their level, there was no need for any probing. As soon as Yi Xian's sword was unleashed, the entire outer world boiled. Countless arrays started burning at this moment. The outer world couldn't withstand the power of this sword. When they saw this scene, the expressions of Gu Qin and the others outside became heavy. The power of Yi Xian's sword was beyond their expectations. Opposite Yi Xian, the defying one slowly closed his eyes. When Yi Xian's sword arrived in front of him, a strange scene appeared. Yi Xian's sword seemed to be moving forward, but in fact, it was moving backward, slashing towards Yi Xian himself. Seeing this scene, Yi Xian's pupils constricted. Moving in the opposite direction. His sword was moving in the opposite direction. At this moment, the sword was extremely fast. In an instant, Yi Xian's sword pierced between his eyebrows. Outside, it was silent. Is it over? Is it over just like this? God Mu stared at Yi Xian, who was in the outer world. By the side, the corners of Gu Qin's mouth curled up into a smile. It's over. The defying one turned around and left. But it didn't take long for him to frown. He turned around and gazed at Yi Xian. Yi Xian grinned. It's not over. Everyone was stunned when they heard this. He's fine. Yi Xian opened his palm, and then the sword between his eyebrows suddenly vanished and reappeared in his hand. The defying one gazed at Yi Xian. Why? Yi Xian replied with a question. What was that energy you used just now? The defying one thought for a moment and said, the energy of defying can reverse everything. The energy of defying. Yi Xian spoke softly. How formidable. The defying one asked another question. Why are you fine? Yi Xian smiled. My physique is slightly special. The defying one nodded. I understand. Then let's continue. As soon as he finished speaking, he took a step forward. As soon as he took that step, the entire outer world suddenly became illusory and gradually transformed into nothingness. It wasn't just that, Yi Xian was gradually vanishing as well. Yi Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. He noticed that the formation of this world was returning to its original state, the defying matter realm. As for himself, he was returning to his most primitive state. What a strange energy. Yi Xian didn't dare think too much about it and didn't dare hold back. He took a step forward, and as soon as he did, countless strands of aura from all over the universe converged onto him. With a single thought, the aura of all the worlds in the universe arrived. Yi Xian suddenly flicked his thumb upwards. His sword was drawn. This sword strike didn't just converge the aura of all the worlds in the universe, it even contained his own aura and sword aura. Even though he didn't utilize his bloodline energy, the aura of this sword strike had arrived at an extremely terrifying level. As soon as this sword strike was executed, the entire outer world was obliterated. The sword tore through the sky. In the distance, the defying one narrowed his eyes slightly. He opened his right hand, and then made a light gesture in front of him. With this gesture, the speed of Yi Xian's sword actually slowed down at this moment. Not only that, but it even showed signs of retreating. He intended to reverse his attack. A wisp of ferocity flashed through Yi Xian's eyes. He took another step forward, and another sword appeared within his sheath. Yi Xian flicked his thumb upwards once more. A tearing sound suddenly resounded, and then a sword tore through the air once more. However, this wasn't the end of it. Another sword appeared within Yi Xian's sheath, and it slashed forward as well. In an instant, Yi Xian had attacked 5 times in succession. The 5 swords were connected from head to tail, and they slashed down towards the defying adept. Bang, bang, bang. The defying adept instantly retreated by almost 150 kilometers, and a wisp of blood seeped out from the corner of his mouth when he stopped moving. A moment later, a ferocious expression flashed through his eyes. All the Daos in the world shall be defied by a single thought of mine. As soon as he finished speaking, he spread open his right hand, and then suddenly flipped it over. As soon as he flipped it over, Yi Xian's 5 swords suddenly started trembling violently. In the next moment, the 5 swords directly pierced towards Yi Xian in a strange shape. It was another reversal. This reversal didn't just defy Yi Xian's sword strike, it even assisted Yi Xian's world. This scene was slightly similar to how the defying adept had defied the child of destiny. However, Yi Xian wasn't the child of destiny. Yi Xian's eyes narrowed slightly, and then another sword appeared within his sheath. He took a step forward and roared furiously, "All the Daos in the world, let us live and die together." As soon as his voice resounded, bang! In an instant, Yi Xian's body started trembling violently while boundless force surged into his body like a tidal wave. In the blink of an eye, his force had arrived at an extremely terrifying level. In the next moment, Yi Xian flicked his thumb lightly. The sword within his sheath flew out once more. This attack was at least a few times stronger than the previous 5 attacks. As soon as this attack appeared, Yi Xian instantly seemed as if he'd been completely drained of energy, and his entire body fell limply to the ground. Moreover, his countenance had turned pale as a sheet. He'd exerted his full strength. However, he still hadn't chosen to use the green profound sword. Yi Xian's final attack carried monstrous force as it tore through the sky. The ancient diagram in Gu Qin's hand had started to burn. A defy. A shun. Who would win? Chapter 2045. Everyone stared fixedly at the outer world that was on the verge of being destroyed. Within the outer world, Yi Xian's sword had arrived before the defying walker. Bang! The space in front of the defying walker caved in. The defying walker's pupils constricted slightly. His defying energy was unable to reverse Yi Xian's attack. He didn't think too much about it and he suddenly punched forward with his left hand. A powerful force swept out from his fist. It was a very direct punch. It wasn't flashy at all. Bang! An expanse of sword light and fist light erupted before everyone's eyes. In the distance, Yi Xian, who was lying on the ground, suddenly closed his eyes slowly. A moment later he pushed up lightly with his thumb. Boom! Another sword flew out from within his scabbard. This was his final attack. The true final attack. Actually, this attack was very risky because he was at the end of his rope. However, he still attacked. He had to do his best in everything. Especially in a fight. If he didn't fight with his life on the line, he might lose his life. As soon as he executed that attack, Yi Xian's aura started to weaken rapidly, and he didn't pay any more attention to the defying walker. He'd done his best. If he still couldn't defeat the defying walker, then he had no other choice. In the distance, Yi Xian's 5th attack stabbed directly onto the defying walker's fist, and the defying walker's formidable strength wasn't able to resist Yi Xian's attack. The sword pierced straight through the defying walker's fist and into his chest. Bang! In an instant, the defying walker's entire body was blasted flying. However, another attack slashed over. The defying walker raised his head and looked at the 6th attack, and his eyes narrowed slightly. In the next moment he opened his left hand and clenched it. Bang! His body shattered by itself. He destroyed his own body. The moment his physical body was destroyed, the 5th sword attack exploded along with his physical body. However, his soul also became illusory in an instant. It should be noted that Yi Xian's 5th sword attack contained an extremely terrifying all-realms aura. Meanwhile, the defying walker closed his eyes slowly, and then he suddenly pressed his palms together. Bang! His soul directly blocked Yi Xian's 6th attack. Rumble. The defying walker retreated several tens of thousands of feet again. When he finally stopped, his soul had already fallen into a pitch-black space-time abyss. However, he forcefully blocked Yi Xian's 6th sword. The sword stopped when it was half an inch away from his forehead. However, the power in the sword was still there. The defying walker held the sword tightly. He could not loosen his grip. Once he loosened his grip, the sword would pierce through his forehead. In his current state, if he was pierced by Yi Xian's 6th sword attack, his soul would definitely collapse. Not only his soul but even his consciousness might be wiped out directly. And he didn't have the power to destroy this sword. The damage that Yi Xian's 5th sword had dealt to him was too great. At this moment, the outer world had vanished completely. However, their battle was not over yet. Neither the Devil Vein nor the Saint Vein interfered, nor did they dare to. Anyone who interfered would have to fight to the death. Thus, Yi Xian and the Defying One were in a stalemate. Who would recover first? At this moment, Yi Xian, who was on the ground in the distance, suddenly opened his eyes slowly. Shi Wang and the others outside were extremely excited at the sight of this. As for Gu Qin and the others, their expressions had turned completely unsightly. Yi Xian stood up slowly. Although his countenance was still extremely pale, it was much better than before. The reason he was able to recover so quickly was naturally because of the undying bloodline. So long as the Defying Walker didn't kill him instantly, then he would be able to recover continuously. The Defying Walker's eyes instantly narrowed when he saw Yi Xian stand up, and he gazed at Yi Xian with a calm expression. Yi Xian took a deep breath. At this moment, his entire body still felt weak as if it had been sucked dry. Those 6 sword strikes from before had consumed all his strength. After a short moment, Yi Xian suddenly walked slowly towards the Defying Walker. The Defying Walker's hands were still clasped together, and his hands were trembling. Yi Xian gazed at the Defying Walker while another sword appeared in the sheath in his left hand. Gu Qin's expression instantly changed when he witnessed this scene, and he was about to attack. But in next to no time he was slightly stunned. In the next moment his expression calmed down and he didn't attack again. Yi Xian suddenly stopped moving and he gazed at the Defying Walker. After a short moment he grinned. Let's call it a draw this time. What do you think? A draw. Su Chong and the others frowned when they heard this. Su Chong was about to speak when he was stopped by the Divine Elder. The Divine Elder gazed at Yi Xian and said, "Don't interfere in the matter between them." Su Chong hesitated for a moment, but he didn't choose to interfere in the end. The Defying Walker fell silent for a moment before he nodded. "All right." As he spoke, he loosened his grip, and the 6th sword strike actually transformed into nothingness. Su Chong's pupils constricted when he witnessed this scene. It turned out that the Defying Walker still had strength and he had been holding back all this time. He was waiting for Yi Xian to attack, and then he would kill Yi Xian with a single strike. Yi Xian had obviously noticed this, so he didn't choose to attack directly. Instead he chose not to attack. If Yi Xian didn't attack, then the Defying Walker wouldn't dare to attack. Because the Defying Walker was afraid that Yi Xian would hold back. Both sides were wary of each other. In the distance, the Defying Walker looked at Yi Xian and said, "You've chosen to comply with the Tendo?" Yi Xian smiled and said, "Yes." The Defying Walker frowned slightly and said, "We cultivators are destined to defy the heavens from the moment we start cultivating. You've chosen to comply with the Tendo? In other words, it's a form of submission." Outside, the expressions of Su Wang and the others turned solemn. Was the Defying Walker going to choose a battle of words? Could Yi Xian defeat him? After all, most of the time, a battle of words was to break the opponent's mental state. In the distance, Yi Xian shook his head and smiled. There's nothing wrong with cultivating. However, what's wrong with the Tendo? The Tendo is also a member of this vast universe. If you want to cultivate, then cultivate. Why do you have to defy others? What has the heavens done wrong? The Defying Walker looked at Yi Xian and said, "Cultivating is the same as fighting against the heavens, isn't it?" However, Yi Xian shook his head and said, "In some small worlds humans need to survive and develop. However, their development will destroy the environment and the ecology. In other words, they are destroying the place that nurtured them. I can't say that humans are at fault. Because humans need to develop and survive, they can only do that. However, what's wrong with the planet they live on? You were born on this planet and this planet nurtured you. One day you became strong. Then you felt that this world was hindering you. Thus you want to defy the heavens." Saying that, he smiled slightly and said, "This is like a person who has raised his son for decades, but in the end, his son thinks that his old age is a burden." The Defying Walker stared at Yi Xian and said, "You're changing the concept." Yi Xian smiled and said, "Then let me ask you, were you born in this universe? If you were, then did this world nurture you? This world nurtured you, but you want to defy the heavens. Let me ask you, what has the Tendo done wrong?" At this moment, the surroundings suddenly trembled and countless spiritual energy surged towards Yi Xian. The Tendo was responding to Yi Xian. Seeing this scene on the other side, Gu Qin's face suddenly turned ugly. Yi Xian said again, "Humans need to cultivate and survive. There's nothing wrong with that. However, I feel that this is everyone's ambition and desire. It has nothing to do with the Tendo. Isn't it a bit too much to turn your ambition and desire into the Tendo's fault?" The Defying Walker stared at Yi Xian and said, "But you cultivate and you are defying the heavens." Yi Xian blinked and said, "If the Tendo also cultivates, then who is it defying?" The Defying Walker's expression froze. Yi Xian continued, "I feel that humans are selfish and I am also selfish. However, we shouldn't be a whore and establish a chastity memorial. If the Tendo really harmed you and you want to defy the heavens, I can understand. The Tendo did not harm you and you want to defy the heavens. I think that's nonsense. In any case, I'm willing to be friends with all the good Tendo in the world." As soon as he finished speaking, a figure silently condensed into appearance in the sky. It was a woman. The woman wore a pure white dress, and there was a little bit of vermilion between her brows. She was very beautiful. Tendo. Xu Wang and the others frowned when they saw the woman. What's this Tendo doing here? There were naturally Tendo in the Grand Skyscraper region as well. However, the Tendo usually didn't have much of a presence. After all, with the strength that Xu Wang and the others possessed right now, ordinary Tendo were truly very weak in their eyes. The woman gazed at Yi Xian and grinned. Thank you. Yi Xian smiled and said, What are you thanking me for? The woman chuckled. Thank you for speaking on our behalf. Yi Xian grinned. Thank all of you for helping me just now. You can come looking for me if you need anything in the future. I'll definitely help you if it's within my ability. The woman hesitated for a moment and said, Really? Yi Xian nodded. The woman bowed slightly. Young man, I know that you're no ordinary person. I'll remember what you said today, and I'll come looking for you if I need any trouble in the future. I hope you won't refuse at that time. As she spoke, she opened her palm and a white brand drifted down slowly. In the end, it entered the center of Yi Xian's forehead. Bang! Yi Xian's figure trembled slightly while a faint brand appeared on the center of his forehead. Yi Xian was quite puzzled. What's that? The woman said, That's a Tendo's brand. Since you possess it, then all the spirits in this universe will assist you. Moreover, the Tendo from other universes will trust you as well if they see this brand. If you need anything, then we'll do our best to assist you as well. Su Chang's eyes narrowed slightly when he heard this. She's trying to befriend that young man. The divine elder spoke softly. That fellow is going to be rich. Su Chong gazed at the divine elder. Why do you say that? The divine elder spoke in a low voice. Earlier he was only able to mobilize the force of an entire world. But now, if he obtains the acknowledgement of those Tendo, then he won't just be able to mobilize force. Instead, he'll be able to mobilize the energy of an entire world. As he spoke, he glanced at Yi Xian. This fellow has become a friend of the Tendo. Chapter 2046. A friend of the Tendo. At this moment, Yi Xian hadn't expected that he would actually obtain the acknowledgement of the Tendo of this world. He knew that living beings like the Tendo were extremely vigilant towards humans and other living beings, but the Wayfarer had actually chosen to give him a Tendo's mark. Of course, this was a good thing. An extraordinarily good thing. He didn't even need to utilize the Grand Tao scripture now. Moreover, he could even draw support from the energy of the universe. There was a huge difference between borrowing power and borrowing power. The Defying One took a deep and long glance at Yi Xian. Let's fight another day. As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and left. Yi Xian watched silently as the Defying One left. Meanwhile, Su Chong and the others appeared by Yi Xian's side. Su Chong sized up Yi Xian. Are you all right? Yi Xian shook his head. I'm going into closed-door cultivation for some time. Su Chong nodded. All right. As he spoke, he gazed at Mu Gu. Make arrangements for him? Yi Xian suddenly smiled. Leader, there's no need to make any arrangements. Just give me a quiet haw. Su Chong hesitated for a moment before he nodded. All right. Yi Xian vanished on the spot. Su Chong spoke softly. I never expected such an outcome. Everyone here nodded. They hadn't expected that it would actually end in a tie. Meanwhile, the God of Peace suddenly spoke softly. This is the best outcome. The Divine Elder nodded. It really is the best outcome. As he spoke, he gazed at the God of Peace. How did you notice this little fellow? Everyone here gazed at the God of Peace. Obviously they were curious as well. The God of Peace fell silent for a moment before he said, I picked him up. Everyone was speechless. Within the Xiao Ta, Yi Xian sat cross-legged on the ground with his eyes closed. Meanwhile, Xiao Ta spoke with excitement. Young master, congratulations. Yi Xian was quite puzzled. What are you congratulating me for? Xiao Ta said, I thought you were going to utilize the green profound sword and the energy of your bloodline, but you didn't. Yi Xian was silent. In fact, he really did not want to use the azure profound sword and the power of his bloodline this time. He had no way of dealing with the experts of the older generation, but the Defying Ones were not experts of the older generation. Yi Xian had his own pride. Meanwhile, Xiao Ta spoke in a low voice. Young master, I've realized that you're actually not so bad. Yi Xian's face darkened. Damn it, was I that bad in your heart before? Xiao Ta hesitated for a moment before he said, I refuse to answer that question. Yi Xian was speechless. Yi Xian didn't want to waste any more time with this guy. He slowly closed his eyes. It had to be said that the battle with the Defying Ones was a little dangerous. Especially the power of the Defying Ones. If he hadn't cultivated the sword physique, then he would have died on the first attack. Most importantly, he was able to sense that the Defying Ones hadn't used all his strength. Especially the fact that the Defying Ones had been able to shatter his sixth attack at the end. This meant that the Defying Ones still had some tricks up their sleeves. At the thought of this, Yi Xian opened his palm, and the green profound sword appeared in his hand. The green profound sword trembled slightly as if it was responding to him. The corners of Yi Xian's mouth curled up slightly. "I'll definitely bring you along to battle next time." The green profound sword trembled for a moment, and then it let out a sword howl. After that, Yi Xian started to heal his injuries. Even though he had the undying bloodline, the 6 attacks he'd executed earlier were still quite an injury to him. A little bit of time wasn't enough for him to fully recover. 4 hours later, Yi Xian's injuries were more or less healed. After that, he immediately went to look for the Divine Elder and the other 2. Yi Xian gazed at the Divine Elder before him. "Senior, I want to continue the battle." The Divine Elder glanced at Yi Xian. "Sure. 1 against 3. Without any suspense, without using the green profound sword and the power of bloodline, he was directly beaten up by the Divine Elder and the other 2. At this moment, Yi Xian realized that he had underestimated the Divine Elder and the other 2. Their battle awareness and teamwork were truly terrifying, especially their teamwork. If he had been the slightest bit careless, he would have been beaten up badly, and he wouldn't even have had the chance to resist. Of course, this made Yi Xian even more excited. Being beaten up meant that he wasn't strong enough, and there was still room for improvement. During the battle with the 3, he insisted on not using the green profound sword and the power of bloodline. The green profound sword was given to him by Qing Er, and the power of bloodline was given to him by his father. Neither of these were cultivated by himself. Strictly speaking, they were considered external objects. He wanted to see if he could really fight without external objects. Devil Veins. Gu Qin stood on the peak of a mountain, and behind him stood a middle-aged man. This man was Muyo, who had returned from his investigation. Gu Qin said softly, "Did the ancient emperor die at the hands of that Yi Xian?" Muyo shook his head. "No. He died at the hands of the person behind him." Gu Qin narrowed his eyes. "The person behind him?" Muyo nodded. "A green-robed man. However, this person is very mysterious. We couldn't find out his background." Gu Qin was silent. Muyo suddenly said, "As far as I know, that Yi Xian came to our place and entered the sacred bloodline, right?" Gu Qin nodded. "Just before that, he fought with the Defying Ones." Hearing this, Muyo frowned. "How is that possible? As far as I know, he isn't very strong. He couldn't even defeat the ancient emperor. In the end, he had to call for help to kill the ancient emperor. How could he have fought with the Defying Ones?" Gu Qin said plainly, "I don't believe it either, but that's the truth." Muyo said solemnly, "In that case, he must have improved during this period. But how long has it been? How could he have improved so much?" Gu Qin's eyes closed slowly. "Nothing is impossible. Don't use common sense to judge some monstrous geniuses." Muyo fell silent. Gu Qin continued, "Are you really unable to find out anything about that green-robed man?" Muyo shook his head. "I can't." Gu Qin fell silent. Meanwhile, Muyo said, "Do you need to take revenge?" Gu Qin gazed at Muyo. "Use your brain and think about it. What sort of power could nurture such a monstrous genius?" Muyo hesitated for a moment and said, "Didn't we nurture a Defying One as well?" Gu Qin shook his head slightly while a wisp of self-ridicule arose on the corners of his mouth. Were Defying Ones nurtured by the Devil Vein? Not at all. Actually, besides him, no one else in the Devil Vein knew that the Defying Ones actually had another identity, and they were only temporarily staying in the Devil Vein. The Devil Vein did not have the ability to nurture a monstrous genius like the Defying Ones. One had to know that the Defying Ones were equivalent to going against the heavens, and they would always be going against the heavens. Such people needed a powerful Tao protector. Otherwise, they would be killed by some mysterious existence before they could grow. Moreover, Yi Xian was not inferior to the Defying Ones. This meant that Yi Xian also had a super terrifying power behind him. Muyo said solemnly, "Then are we just going to let it go? The ancient emperor is the Range Master's grandson." Gu Qin frowned slightly. "The ancient emperor? I don't know him. What does he have to do with our Devil Vein?" Muyo's face was filled with astonishment. Gu Qin looked at Muyo. "Remember, the ancient emperor has nothing to do with our Devil Vein." With that, he turned and left. To offend a genius who might have a terrifying power behind him for the sake of the ancient emperor, how stupid would that be? Muyo laughed bitterly and turned to leave. On the other side of the mountain peak, The defying one stood silently. His eyes were closed and no one knew what he was thinking. At this moment, Gu Qin appeared by his side. The defying one said softly, "I'm leaving." Gu Qin frowned slightly. "So soon?" The defying ones nodded. "They're here to pick me up." As he spoke, he looked into the distance. "I'm going to meet him." After he finished speaking, he had already disappeared. Gu Qin hesitated for a moment, then hurriedly led a group of Devil Vein experts to follow. Saint Meridian. Yi Xian, who was fighting, suddenly stopped. In the next moment he left the illusory world with the Divine Elder and the rest. Above the Saint Meridian, the space suddenly tore apart, and the defying ones appeared. Yi Xian looked at the defying ones and did not frown. This guy wouldn't be here to pick a fight with him again, right? Su Chong and the rest also frowned. Obviously they also thought that the defying ones was here to pick a fight with Yi Xian. The defying ones looked at Yi Xian. "I'm leaving." "Leaving?" Yi Xian was slightly taken aback. "Where are you going?" The defying ones thought for a moment and said, "Home." Yi Xian said in a low voice, "You're not from a devil vein?" The defying ones nodded. "I'm just temporarily tempering myself in a devil vein. Now that time is up, it's time for me to leave." Yi Xian glanced at the defying ones and said, "Where are you from?" The defying ones replied, "Eternal Night." Yi Xian frowned slightly. "Eternal Night?" The defying ones frowned as well. "You've never heard of it?" Yi Xian blinked. "Have you heard of the Milky Way?" The defying ones shook his head. "Never." Yi Xian said seriously, "You've actually never heard of such an amazing world like the Milky Way?" The defying ones looked at Yi Xian. "Is the Milky Way very amazing?" Yi Xian said seriously, "Very." The defying ones pondered for a moment and said, "Why haven't I heard of it?" Yi Xian smiled. "It's normal that you haven't heard of it. Most people don't know about the Milky Way." The defying one said, "I'm a little curious. Brother Yi, can you tell me about how amazing that place is?" Yi Xian was silent for a moment before saying, "There's a terrifying expert there. She's called the strongest destiny. Now that she's there, the Milky Way is protected by her. It's the strongest world in the entire universe." The strongest destiny. The defying ones frowned again. "I've never heard of it either." Yi Xian was about to speak when the distant sky suddenly split open. The next moment, a group of experts in black armor appeared above the holy vein. There were 32 of them. And among them, 30 of them were telekinesis realm. This wasn't the most terrifying thing. The most terrifying thing was that the two leaders were actually Dao Ming realm. Seeing this scene, Yi Xian's face immediately darkened. He couldn't help but curse in his heart, "Telekinesis realm? Damn, this map is too fast. Who can withstand it? *CK. 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 Chapter 2047. With the appearance of those experts, Su Chong and the others' expressions changed drastically. Who was this defying walker? In the sky, the leading Dao Ming realm expert walked slowly to the defying walker and bowed slightly. "Young master." The defying walker nodded and looked at Yi Xian. "See you later." Yi Xian smiled. "See you later." The defying walker nodded slightly and looked at Gu Qin, the demonic veins leader. He opened his palm and a black ancient book slowly floated to Gu Qin. "Thank you for taking care of me these days. This is a small token of my appreciation. Please accept it, Gu Qin." Gu Qin hesitated for a moment and then put away the ancient book. "If you have time in the future, come back and take a look." The defying walker smiled. "Definitely." As he spoke, he looked at Yi Xian. "Brother Yi, if you have the chance, come to Eternal Night Continent to play. There are countless geniuses there, it's suitable for you." Yi Xian smiled. "If I have the chance, I will definitely go." The defying walker nodded and did not say anything else. He turned and walked slowly towards the sky. The Dao Ming realm expert glanced at Yi Xian, then turned and followed. Before long, the defying walker and his group disappeared into the horizon. In the sky, Gu Qin glanced at Yi Xian. At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly asked, "Gu Qin, I have a question to ask. Is Ancient Emperor from your demonic vein?" "Ancient Emperor?" Gu Qin frowned. "What Ancient Emperor?" Yi Xian frowned. "You don't know him?" Gu Qin shook his head. "I don't know him. There is no one called Ancient Emperor in my demonic vein." "Young master, you must have recognized the wrong person." Yi Xian glanced at Gu Qin. Could Ancient Emperor be pretending to be from the demonic vein? At this moment, Gu Qin said, "Young master Yi, if you have the chance, come to demonic vein to play. Farewell." As he spoke, he turned and disappeared into the horizon. In the same place, Yi Xian was silent for a moment before shaking his head and smiling. He looked at Su Chong. "Senior, what is Eternal Night Continent?" Su Chong hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. "I don't know." Yi Xian said solemnly. "You don't know either?" Su Chong smiled bitterly. "That should be a more advanced civilization." Yi Xian was silent. At this time, God Mu suddenly said, "Are you leaving?" Yi Xian smiled and said, "Not for now." As he spoke, he looked at the Divine Elder and the other two. "Elders, let's continue our cultivation." Elder Shen nodded. "All right." After saying that, the four of them disappeared on the spot. At this moment, Mugu suddenly asked, "Where did he come from?" Su Chong said softly, "Did you see his expression just now?" Mugu looked at Su Chong. "What expression?" Su Chong smiled bitterly. When he saw the experts behind the Defying Ones, he wasn't the least bit surprised or fearful. Mugu and Mu Shen's expressions became solemn when they heard this. Why wasn't Yi Shen surprised? Why weren't they afraid? Obviously, there was only one answer, and that was the force behind Yi Shen was not any weaker than the Defying Ones. Su Chong suddenly said softly, "He should be leaving soon." Mugu nodded. "I wonder if he will go to Eternal Night?" Mugu did not speak. In the Void World, Yi Shen was still fighting with the Divine Elder and the other two. He was still fighting 1 against 3. He was still being suppressed by the Divine Elder and the other two. However, the more he fought, the more excited he became. A battle of life and death was the easiest way to stimulate a person's potential. During this period of time, his body had been shattered no less than 100 times. If he was careless, his body would be directly shattered. Of course, the three of them were sparring partners and had no intention of destroying his divine soul. Even so, Yi Shen's mind was tense. This time, he was also very tense and did not dare to be careless. As for the Divine Elder and the other two, they were also starting to feel a little strained. Although Yi Shen was being suppressed by the three of them, Yi Shen was getting stronger and stronger as he fought. Facing those swords of Yi Shen, they did not dare to be careless at all. 2 hours later, the four of them stopped and began to sum up. The Divine Elder was the first to speak. "Your reaction is very fast. Now you can barely resist the three of us. However, you have to understand that the best defense is offense. If you keep defending, you will only give us the opportunity to attack you. Do you understand?" Yi Shen nodded. "I know that. However, the three of you are cooperating too well. I can't find any flaws." Elder Chiu smiled. "When I saw you fighting with the Defying Ones, you used a total of 6 swords, right?" Yi Shen nodded. Elder Chiu thought for a while and said, "Those 6 swords were casually used by you, right?" Yi Shen nodded again. Elder Chiu smiled. "Why don't you create another sword skill?" Yi Shen was astounded. "Create another sword skill?" Elder Chiu nodded. "With your current strength, when you condense the power of the myriad world, your limit is 6 strikes. Moreover, I've discovered that the speed at which you strike with your sword is extremely fast. If your speed is a little faster and you can strike with 6 strikes in an instant, the power of the 6 strikes will merge into a single point and break through a single area. Then, the power of your 6 strikes will greatly increase." Yi Shen fell into deep thought. Elder Chiu continued, "All of your sword skills are very powerful, and all of them have their own unique advantages. You can combine them to create a new sword skill, because your split sword play isn't quite enough for now." Yi Shen spoke in a low voice. "Can I?" Elder Chiu smiled. "Let's try." The corners of Yi Shen's mouth curled up slightly. "Let's try." Elder Chiu and the other two retreated 3 kilometers away. Yi Shen closed his eyes slowly and pressed his left thumb against the hilt of his sword, ready to strike. At this moment, the 3 of them suddenly disappeared. Almost at the same time, Yi Shen pressed his thumb against the hilt of his sword. Swoosh! A sword pierced through the air. Almost at the same time, another sword flew out of Yi Shen's scabbard, followed by another sword. 3 swords in a single thought. All 3 swords carried his own sword momentum and aura. Boom! 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 In the distance, the 3 swords suddenly shattered. At the same time, Elder Chiu and the other 2 retreated almost 3 kilometers away. Yi Shen was stunned when he saw this. This was the first time he had the upper hand since he fought with Elder Chiu and the other 2. In the distance, Elder Chiu glanced at his right hand. There was a deep sword mark on his right arm. If that sword had been slightly stronger, his arm would have been gone. Looking at Yi Shen, Elder Chiu said with a smile, "Your sword can go even faster, right?" Yi Shen nodded, "Yes." His instant sword of life and death hadn't reached his limit, and it could be faster. Meanwhile, the divine elder said, "Again." Yi Xian nodded, "All right." As soon as he finished speaking, another sword appeared in his scabbard. Yi Xian couldn't bring them to Xiao Ta's world. After all, the world within Xiao Ta's body couldn't endure their strength. However, it didn't matter to him now. Presently, he didn't rely so much on the green profound sword, the energy of his bloodline, and Xiao Ta. 3 months later. In the world of nothingness. Yi Xian sat cross-legged on the ground while the three divine elders stood before him. A short while later, Yi Xian stood up and gazed at the three divine elders. In the next moment, the three of them vanished on the spot. Meanwhile, Yi Xian flicked his thumb lightly. 6 rays of light tore through the surroundings. Bang, bang, bang. 3 explosions resounded, and then the 3 divine elders were blasted over 30 kilometers away. After the 3 of them stopped, their right hands were completely severed. Not only that, but their bodies were covered in sword wounds, which were caused by the sword qi that splashed on them. Presently they couldn't get close to Yi Xian at all. If it was a one-on-one battle, then they wouldn't be a match for Yi Xian at all. Meanwhile, Elder Mu, who led the group, spoke softly, "If these 6 attacks of yours are coupled with the energy of the myriad of worlds and worlds that day, I'm afraid you'll be able to instantly annihilate us." The Divine Elder and Elder Chiu had solemn expressions on their faces. Just as Elder Mu had said, if Yi Xian utilized the energy of the myriad of worlds and worlds, then its strength would be a few times stronger than it was now. Meanwhile, Elder Mu spoke abruptly, "According to what I know, you have a special sword, right?" Yi Xian nodded. He opened his palm, and the green profound sword appeared in his grasp. Elder Mu glanced at the green profound sword. "Do you want to use this sword to test the might of your newly created sword technique?" Yi Xian blinked. "Against the 3 of you?" Elder Mu nodded. "We want to witness the might of this sword as well." Yi Xian hesitated for a moment before he said, "Elder Mu, this sword is quite ferocious." Elder Mu smiled. "It's fine. We'll give it a try." Yi Xian thought for a moment and said, "All right." Actually, he wanted to give it a try as well. Yi Xian gazed at Elder Mu and the others. "Seniors, be careful." Elder Mu smiled. "Bring it on." Yi Xian closed his eyes slowly, and then he pressed his thumb lightly against the hilt of the green profound sword, causing it to suddenly fly forward. In an instant, the entire world of nothingness was obliterated. The expressions of Elder Mu and the others changed drastically, and they hurriedly attacked in unison. Bang! Along with an explosion, Elder Mu and the others were blasted over 100 kilometers back. When they stopped moving, only their souls remained. Moreover, their souls were vanishing at an extremely terrifying speed. Their souls would be obliterated in a few breaths of time at most, and they would be completely obliterated. Yi Xian's expression changed drastically when he witnessed this scene, and he hurriedly utilized the green profound sword to suppress their souls. At this moment, Elder Mu and the others were still in a state of shock because they'd almost been obliterated. Elder Mu gazed at Yi Xian with an extremely solemn expression. "Your sword?" Yi Xian gazed at the green profound sword in his hand. Actually, he was quite surprised because the might of this sword had slightly exceeded his expectations as well. After he improved his strength and utilized the green profound sword, it felt like he was like a tiger that had grown wings. It was extremely terrifying. Moreover, he hadn't even utilized the energy of his bloodline and the energy of the universe. If he were to utilize all of them, then he was confident in his ability to instantly annihilate a Tao Radiance Realm expert. Meanwhile, Elder Mu shook his head and smiled. "We're unable to help you anymore." Yi Xian bowed respectfully to them. He respected the 3 of them from the bottom of his heart. The Divine Elder smiled. "Are you leaving?" Yi Xian nodded. "I'm going to look for stronger experts." The Divine Elder hesitated for a moment and said, "I have a presumptuous request." Yi Xian smiled. "Please speak." The Divine Elder spoke in a low voice. "Can you leave an inheritance of your sword Tao here? Perhaps an outstanding genius in the sword Tao like you will appear in our saint bloodline many years from now." Yi Xian thought for a moment. "All right." The Divine Elder and the others hurriedly bowed slightly to Yi Xian. "Thank you." Chapter 2048. Sword Tao Inheritance. Yi Xian's sword Tao inheritance was no ordinary sword Tao. If Yi Xian left a part of his inheritance here as long as the sacred bloodline was used well, then the sacred bloodline might produce 1 or even more sword Tao experts in the future. Sword Tao had always been the sacred bloodline's weakest area because the sacred bloodline had never produced a particularly powerful swordsman. When they learned that Yi Xian was willing to leave a part of sword Tao inheritance in the sacred bloodline, Su Chong and the others were extremely excited. The Divine Elder and the others cared about the inheritance, but Su Chong cared about the fate. Today he had sown a good karma and he would reap good karma in the future. This was what he cared about the most. After Yi Xian left the sacred bloodline, he directly left the sacred bloodline. In the starry sky, Yi Xian, who was about to leave, suddenly turned his head and saw a woman standing not far to his right. It was Goddess Mu. Seeing Goddess Mu, Yi Xian was slightly stunned, then smiled and said, "Miss Goddess Mu." Goddess Mu looked at Yi Xian. "Are you going to Eternal Night?" Yi Xian shook his head and smiled, "I don't know. In any case, I will keep moving forward to follow in my father's footsteps." Goddess Mu walked in front of Yi Xian. "Follow in your father's footsteps?" Yi Xian nodded. Goddess Mu thought about it, then said, "I am very curious about your background." Yi Xian said with a smile, "I just have an invincible father and younger sister. Oh, I also have a sworn brother. As for the rest, I don't seem to have much." Goddess Mu looked at Yi Xian. "How invincible are you?" Yi Xian said seriously, "Do you think I am strong?" Goddess Mu nodded, "Very strong." Yi Xian thought about it, then said, "I should be able to take 3 sword strikes from my father at most." Xiao Ta. Goddess Mu frowned, "Only 3 sword strikes?" Yi Xian nodded, "Terrifying, right?" Goddess Mu said solemnly, "Is your father a manifestation realm expert?" Yi Xian smiled and said, "I don't know either." Mu Shen thought for a moment and said, "Will he come back?" Yi Xian looked around, then smiled and said, "When I come back in the future, I will definitely come here to see you." God Mu nodded. "All right." As she spoke, she opened her palm and a token appeared in front of Yi Xian. Yi Xian was puzzled. "This is?" The Harmony God replied, "Those who possess this token are my direct disciples. Even though we are not master and disciple, we are master and disciple in name, am I right?" Yi Xian thought for a moment before taking the token. "Miss Peace, we will meet again." With that, he turned around and flew up on his sword, disappearing into the starry sky in the blink of an eye. God Mu looked at the starry sky far away, thinking about something. At the end of the distant starry sky, Yi Xian, who was riding on his sword, suddenly turned his head to look. Not far away, an afterimage swept over. Yi Xian was stunned. The person was God Ai. God Ai rushed to Yi Xian and said hurriedly, "Brother Yi, wait for me." Yi Xian smiled. "Are you here to send me off?" God Ai shook his head. "No. I'm here to go with you." Yi Xian was slightly stunned. "Go with me?" God Ai nodded. "I want to follow you for a period of time." Yi Xian was puzzled. "Why?" God Ai hesitated for a moment and said, "I just want to follow you, big brother." Yi Xian smiled. "You might get beaten up if you follow me." God Ai said seriously, "I'm not afraid." Yi Xian thought for a moment and said, "Then let's go together." God Ai nodded. "Big brother, please?" Yi Xian was speechless. On the other side, Destiny's Child looked at the starry sky, thinking about something. At this moment, Su Chong appeared beside Destiny's Child. He looked at Destiny's Child and said with a smile, "Aren't you going with him?" In fact, he also hoped that Destiny's Child would follow Yi Xian. After all, if God Ai followed Yi Xian, he would gain the benefits of free transformation. Destiny's Child said calmly, "Does Master want me to be like God Ai and be someone else's follower?" Su Chong sighed softly. "You know that's not what I mean." Destiny's Child slowly closed his eyes. "I won't be worse than them. Let's wait and see." After saying that, he turned and left. On the spot, Su Chong sighed softly and left. In the depths of the starry sky, Yi Xian looked at God Ai beside him. "Have you fully grasped the inheritance?" God Ai nodded. "I've basically grasped it." Yi Xian smiled. "How do you feel?" God Ai said in a deep voice, "Free transformation. Very, very strong." Yi Xian was curious. "How strong is it?" God Ai thought about it and said, "Very, very strong." Yi Xian was speechless. God Ai looked at Yi Xian and said with a smile, "Brother Yi, I've already reached the Daoming realm." Daoming. Yi Xian was stunned. Then he sized up God Ai. However, God Ai was still at the telekinesis realm. God Ai said again, "I've hidden my realm." Yi Xian said in a deep voice, "You've reached the Daoming realm so quickly?" God Ai nodded. "However, I've reached a bottleneck. To reach free transformation, there are many harsh requirements. For example, the first one requires a huge amount of spiritual energy to support it. Unfortunately, the only star vein in our universe has been taken by that defying one. What a pity." Yi Xian said, "Is your current goal to find a star vein?" God Ai nodded. However, this is very difficult. Because only those top forces should have star veins. It's too difficult for me to get one. As he spoke, he looked at Yi Xian. Yi Xian's eyelids twitched. Why are you looking at me? I don't have a star vein either. God Eye hesitated for a moment and said, Brother, why don't we snatch one? Yi Xian's face darkened. Do you want to get beaten up? God Eye thought for a moment and said, That's true. Sigh, what a headache. Yi Xian said, The best way is to join a super force and let them nurture you and help you reach free transformation. I believe that if you can reach free transformation, many forces will be willing to help you. God Eye nodded. That's the only way. As he spoke, he looked into the distance. Brother Yi, are we going to everlasting night? Yi Xian shook his head. I don't know. God Eye looked at Yi Xian. You don't know? Yi Xian said with a smile, Wherever we go. God Eye. In the starry sky, the two raised their speed to the limit. Half a month later. Yi Xian and God Eye felt a headache because they had passed through dozens of star fields in the past half a month. However, these star fields were dead and there was no life or civilization. At a certain spot in the silent starry sky, God's Eye glanced at the surroundings and said, Brother Yi, have we gotten lost? Yi Xian looked around and nodded. I think it's possible. God Eye. At this moment, several powerful auras suddenly appeared in the distance. Seeing this scene, the two were stunned at first and then they were delighted. They finally saw living people. At this moment, the spacetime in front of them suddenly tore open and the next moment, 3 men in black robes walked out. All 3 of them were at telekinesis. The leading man in black robes sized up Yi Xian and God Eye. You two are? Yi Xian cupped his fists. We are lost. May I ask where this is? Lost? The black-robed man frowned slightly. Where are all of you from? Yi Xian replied, The Great Skyscraper region. The black-robed man shook his head. I've never heard of it. Yi Xian smiled. Where are we? The black-robed man replied, This is the Daylight Plane. The Daylight Plane? Yi Xian frowned slightly. Is it related to the Eternal Night Plane? The black-robed man's eyes narrowed slightly, and a strand of his divine sense locked onto Yi Xian. You know of the Eternal Night Plane. It was filled with hostility. God Eye was about to speak when Yi Xian smiled and said, I've only heard of it, but I've never been there. The black-robed man gazed at Yi Xian and didn't speak. Yi Xian smiled, We really are from the Great Skyscraper region. The black-robed man fell silent for a moment before he said, Continue forward and you'll arrive at the Daylight Plane. However, I don't recommend that you go there because your origins are unknown, and the Daylight Plane might not allow you to enter. Yi Xian was puzzled. What? The black-robed man glanced at Yi Xian, but he didn't speak another word. He just led the others behind him away. God Eye gazed at Yi Xian. What's going on? Yi Xian spoke indifferently, The Daylight Plane and the Eternal Night Plane probably aren't on good terms. God Eye spoke solemnly, Then are we still going? Yi Xian smiled, Let's go. God Eye hesitated for a moment and said, Didn't that person say? Yi Xian smiled, We can sneak in. As soon as he finished speaking, he vanished on the spot with God Eye. Around 4 hours later, Yi Xian and God Eye entered an unknown region of the starry sky. Both Yi Xian and God Eye were quite surprised when they entered this region. There was an extremely dazzling ray of white light at the end of their field of vision, and it just traversed the depths of the starry sky. God Eye glanced at it. What's that? Yi Xian shook his head. I don't know. At this moment, several divine consciousnesses swept in their direction. Yi Xian and the God's Eye immediately hid. The 2 divine consciousnesses scanned the location where Yi Xian and the God's Eye were, and soon the 2 divine consciousnesses disappeared. Yi Xian glanced into the distance and then disappeared with God Eye. Around 2 hours later, both of them arrived in front of an ancient city. In front of the city gate, Yi Xian glanced at the top of the city gate, and there were 3 large words. Daylight City. Daylight. After Yi Xian entered the city with God Eye, both of them found that the city was very prosperous. Not only that, but many of the cultivators in the city were very strong. Although there weren't telekinesis realm experts everywhere, there were still many. From time to time, they would encounter a telekinesis realm expert. Of course, they didn't encounter a single Dao Ming realm expert. God Eye looked at Yi Xian. Brother Yi, what do we do now? Yi Xian looked around and then said, Let's first figure out this daylight realm. God Eye asked, How do we do that? Yi Xian looked at God Eye. Can you not be so ambiguous with your words? God Eye frowned slightly. Is there a problem with this sentence? Yi Xian, Ignoring God Eye, Yi Xian's divine sense swept around, and the next moment he was stunned. There was actually a familiar aura. Who was it? P.S. Erupt tomorrow. Chapter 2049. Yi Xian vanished on the spot with God Eye, and it didn't take long for them to arrive at a spacious square. At this moment, the square was filled with a sea of people. Yi Xian looked into the distance and saw a familiar person on a stone platform in the distance. Heaven Loathsome. Yi Xian hadn't expected to encounter Heaven Loathsome here. What's this woman doing in the daylight plane? Meanwhile, Heaven Loathsome seemed to sense something and looked towards the crowd. She was slightly stunned when she saw Yi Xian, and her eyes were filled with astonishment. Obviously, she hadn't expected to encounter Yi Xian here. Heaven Loathsome hesitated for a moment, and then she stood up and appeared in front of Yi Xian in the next moment. What are you doing here? Yi Xian smiled. I was wandering around for a while and then I came here. Heaven Loathsome frowned slightly. Wandering around? Yi Xian nodded. Heaven Loathsome fell silent for a moment. Do you know where this is? Yi Xian said, the daylight plane. Heaven Loathsome nodded. Yi Xian suddenly asked, what are you doing here? Heaven Loathsome glanced around and said, let's go somewhere else? Yi Xian nodded, all right. He really wanted to get to know this daylight plane well. The three of them were about to leave when a man suddenly appeared by Heaven Loathsome's side. He glanced at Yi Xian and God Eye and then he smiled. Heaven Loathsome, who are they? Heaven Loathsome turned to look at the man, and then she slapped him. Slap. The man was blasted away before he could even react. Yi Xian and God Eye were stunned. Heaven Loathsome glanced coldly at the man. Heaven Loathsome? Do we know each other very well? As soon as she finished speaking, she looked at Yi Xian. Let's go. Yi Xian was speechless. The man glanced resentfully at Heaven Loathsome from afar, and no one knew what he was thinking. On the other side, Yi Xian hesitated for a moment before he said, Heaven's Malice, who is he? Heaven's Loathsome said flatly, he's the son of an elder in Daybreak City. He's like you when he sees a woman. Yi Xian hurriedly said, Tianyan, don't talk nonsense. What do you mean by the same as me? Fuck Yi Xian. Heaven's Loathsome interrupted Yi Xian. I'm saying that he's a second-generation heir just like you. Yi Xian was speechless. Before long, Heaven's Loathsome brought them to a restaurant. Heaven's Loathsome picked up the bowl of wine in front of him and gulped it down. Then he looked at Yi Xian and said, Are you here to cause trouble in the White Day realm again? Yi Xian's face darkened. What are you talking about? Then what are you doing here? Heaven's Loathsome asked. Yi Xian thought for a moment and said, Heaven Hatred, what sort of place is the Daybreak Plane? After a moment of silence, Heaven's Loathsome began to explain to Yi Xian. Actually, this universe was called the Celestial Pole Universe. In this universe there were two superpowers. One was Evernight City and the other was Daybreak City. The two superpowers had always been enemies. Their grudges were so deep that it was indescribable. Either way they would definitely fight when they met. Yi Xian said in a low voice, You joined the White Day realm? Heaven's Loathsome nodded. I had to get some cultivation resources. In other words, star veins. Yi Xian said in a low voice, What realm are you at now? He asked because he couldn't see through Heaven's Loathsome realm. Heaven's Loathsome said in a low voice, Enlightened. Fuck. Yi Xian jumped up. You've enlightened? Are you kidding me? Heaven's Loathsome looked at Yi Xian and said, Am I useless in your eyes? Yi Xian smiled sheepishly and said, Of course not. It's just that. You're too fast. You should know that when we parted you were just in the inner circle. Heaven's Loathsome drank another bowl of wine and said, Aren't you growing fast as well? Yi Xian said in a low voice, Did you join the Daybreak City for the Star Vein? Heaven's Loathsome nodded and said, Yes. Yi Xian asked hurriedly, Did you get it? Heaven's Loathsome shook his head and said, It's very difficult. Yi Xian frowned and said, You're such a monster. Why didn't the Daybreak City nurture you? Heaven's Loathsome looked at Yi Xian and said, Do you know how many Dao Ming realm cultivators there are in the Daybreak City? Yi Xian shook his head. Heaven's Loathsome raised a finger and said, More than 100. And all of them wanted to obtain the Star Vein. However, in the entire Daybreak City, there are only 9 Star Veins left, and for a Dao Ming realm cultivator to reach the free transformation realm, they need at least 1 Star Vein spiritual chi, some even need 2. Moreover, there is no guarantee of success. Then she shook her head and said, Under these circumstances, the conditions to get the Star Vein are very, very harsh. God, I couldn't help but ask, How harsh? Heaven's Loathsome said, The first condition is to kill 10 Dao Ming realm cultivators in the Eternal Darkness faction. The second condition is to be number 1 on the God list. That is, the one who wins the competition among more than 100 Dao Ming realm cultivators will have the chance to get the Star Vein. The third condition is to swear on your soul and consciousness that you will be loyal to the Daybreak City for the rest of your life. If you disobey, your soul will be destroyed. Hearing this, God Eye's expression immediately turned a little ugly. Yi Xian said softly, "It's a bit difficult." Heaven's Loathsome said, "It's more than difficult. It's hopeless. But there's no other way. Actually, there's another way to get the Star Vein." Yi Xian was curious and asked, "What kind?" Heaven's Loathsome said, "Monster. A true super monster, the kind that can shock the entire Daybreak City. Daybreak City will open a back door for such a monster." Yi Xian said solemnly, "As far as I know, the Imperial God gathered the Star Vein on his own. Why can't you do the same?" Heaven's Vexation said solemnly, "I know a little about this Imperial God that you speak of. There are also some legends about him here. However, no one knows how he managed to condense the Star Veins. Furthermore, some people say that he didn't condense the Star Veins himself and that he got lucky. Of course, no one knows what it is exactly." Yi Xian looked at God Eye and God Eye shook his head. "There are no records about the Star Vein in Master's inheritance." Yi Xian fell silent. He hadn't expected the Star Vein to be so difficult to get. Meanwhile, Heaven's Loathsome suddenly looked at Yi Xian. "King Kaoshan, can I borrow a Star Vein from you?" Yi Xian looked at Tianyi. "Where would I get a Star Vein? I don't even have one." Heaven's Loathsome said, "You can ask your father. He definitely has one." Yi Xian spoke flatly, "I don't know where he is right now." Heaven's Loathsome frowned slightly when he heard this. Yi Xian laughed, "Don't even think about it. I have to rely on myself." Heaven's Loathsome puckered his lips and didn't say anything. Yi Xian looked at God Eye. "It seems like the path of embodiment transformation is going to be difficult for you." God Eye fell silent for a while before he said, "Big brother, I'll follow you. You think of a way." Yi Xian's face darkened. "I'll think of a way for you. Do you think I'm a god?" God Eye spoke solemnly, "In any case, I'll follow you." Yi Xian was speechless. Meanwhile, Heaven's Loathsome said, "If you want to join the Daytime Alliance, you have to think it through. Once you do, you'll be dragged into the enmity between Daytime City and Evernight City. At that time, even if you don't kill the members of Evernight City, they'll kill you. Think it through." Yi Xian turned around to look at God Eye. "What do you think?" God Eye hesitated for a moment and said, "What about you?" Yi Xian shook his head. "I don't need Star Veins because my goal isn't embodiment transformation." God Eye was puzzled. "Why?" Yi Xian chuckled. "I have my own path to take." God Eye hesitated for a moment and said, "Then I have no choice but to join Daytime City." Yi Xian spoke solemnly, "You have to think it through." God Eye laughed bitterly. "I have no other choice. Isn't that right?" Yi Xian gazed at Heaven's Loathsome. Heaven's Loathsome spoke flatly, "He's at the Dao Ming realm, so it won't be difficult for him to join Daytime City. However, obtaining Star Veins will be very difficult." Yi Xian said, "I have no choice but to join for now." Heaven's Loathsome gazed at Yi Xian. "What about you? Are you interested in Daybreak City?" Yi Xian shook his head. Heaven's Loathsome nodded and didn't speak further. Meanwhile, God Eye spoke abruptly, "Brother Yi, why don't you join Daytime City with us? Join now and work hard. Perhaps you'll be able to obtain Star Veins in the future." Heaven's Loathsome gazed at God Eye. "You aren't familiar with King Kaoshan, right?" God Eye was puzzled. "Why do you ask?" Heaven's Loathsome shook his head slightly. "You're the one who needs to work hard, not him. If you don't believe me, you can ask him if he's ever worried about cultivation resources." God Eye gazed at Yi Xian. Yi Xian rubbed his nose. "I don't think so." Although his journey was bumpy, he didn't have to worry about cultivation resources at all. He didn't have to worry about techniques either. God Eye was speechless. Suddenly, a man walked into the restaurant. It was the man who'd been beaten up by Heaven's Loathsome earlier. Heaven's Loathsome frowned slightly when he saw the man. There was an old man by his side. The old man walked slowly to Yi Xian and the others. He looked at Heaven's Loathsome. "Miss Heaven's Loathsome, how did my son offend you? Why did you humiliate him in public?" Heaven's Loathsome raised his bowl and took a sip before he said, "Ask your son if I told him not to bother me at the beginning." The old man looked at Heaven's Loathsome. "Everyone loves beauty. What's wrong with him wanting to befriend you, Miss Heaven's Loathsome?" Heaven's Loathsome looked at the old man. "You're right, but I don't want to befriend him. I'm pissed that he's come to bother me again and again. Do you understand? The old man glared at Heaven's Loathsome. Heaven's Loathsome suddenly stood up and stared at the old man. If you're not happy, we'll fight one-on-one in the life and death realm. We'll fight to the death. As long as you agree, we'll go right now. Once we're in the life and death realm, I'll kill you first and then your son. The old man narrowed his eyes. Are you that confident, Miss Heaven's Loathsome? Heaven's Loathsome was about to speak when the old man's son suddenly said, You don't want me to call you Heaven's Loathsome, so why can he call you Heaven's Loathsome? He pointed at Yi Xian as he spoke. Yi Xian, Heaven's Loathsome glanced at the man. His dad is more awesome than yours, understand? Yi Xian. Chapter 2050. The man was slightly stunned when he heard her, and then he spoke fiercely, You humiliated me. She glanced at him with disdain, and then she gazed at the old man. Are you going to fight or not? She clenched her right fist slowly as she spoke, and she was ready to fight. However, it still depended on the old man because fighting was not allowed in this place. Even though she had a bad temper, it didn't represent that she was stupid. The old man's expression was quite unsightly when he heard her. Fight? Truthfully speaking, he wasn't confident in his ability to do so. Even though Heaven Loathing hadn't been in Daybreak City for long, she was quite famous in the city. Because she challenged an expert on the divine rankings as soon as she arrived, and she'd even won. Now she was ranked at the 16th position on the divine rankings. That was a very high ranking. The man was about to say something when Heaven Loathing suddenly turned around to look at him. A moment later, her hand clamped down on the man's throat. The old man's expression changed drastically. Heaven Loathing, what are you doing? A wisp of ferocity flashed through her eyes. What am I doing? Old bastard. That grandson of yours has repeatedly come to harass me, yet you didn't restrain him and instead brought him here to reason with me. Damn it. Since you don't teach your son properly, then I'll kill him and give birth to another one. As soon as she finished speaking, she clenched her right fist. Bang. The man was instantly obliterated. He'd been forcefully obliterated. Yi Xian's eyelids twitched when he witnessed this scene. Damn it. She's still so hot-tempered. The old man's expression instantly became ferocious when he saw his son being killed, and he was just about to attack. Meanwhile, a white-robed man appeared here and he smiled. Elder you. The old man glanced at the young man, and then he frowned while a trace of fear could be seen in his eyes. The young man smiled. Elder you, if you want to fight, then please go to the life dimension with Miss Heaven Loathing. This isn't a place to fight. The old man spoke furiously. Didn't you see that she attacked first? The young man smiled. It wouldn't be a problem if you could kill Miss Heaven Loathing in an instant. After all, it's not destructive at all. The old man's expression instantly became unsightly, and he glanced coldly at Heaven Loathing. Just you wait. As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and left. The young man looked at Heaven Vexation. Miss Heaven Vexation, please don't fight here next time. Thank you. With that, he turned around and left. Heaven's Loathsome sat down and continued drinking. Yi Xian looked at Heaven Loathsome. Who was that old man? He's an elder in Daylight City. He has some power, but his strength isn't much. Yi Xian said solemnly, If you do this, will he make things difficult for you? Heaven's Malignity's expression was calm. If he dares, I'll kill him. Yi Xian was speechless. Heaven's Loathsome turned to look out the window and said softly, King Kaoshan, I know you like to keep a low profile. You like to pretend to be a pig to eat a tiger. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that. However, you'd better be more direct in this place. The law of the jungle here was even more blatant. If you don't act tough, there will be a lot of people bullying you. As soon as she finished speaking, she picked up the cup of wine in front of her and drank it in one gulp before she said, Let's go. As soon as she finished speaking, she stood up and left. After taking 2 steps, she stopped and turned around to look at God's Eye. Didn't you want to join Daybreak City? Why aren't you leaving? God's Eye looked at Yi Xian, and Yi Xian nodded slightly. God's Eye stood up and left with Heaven's Malignity. After the two of them left, Yi Xian picked up the cup of wine on the table and drank it in one gulp. He was about to leave when the young man in white robes from before walked over again. Yi Xian looked at the young man in white robes. You are. The young man in white robes smiled and said, Mu Chen, the owner of this restaurant. Yi Xian smiled and said, What do you need? Mu Chen sat in front of Yi Xian and opened his palm. A bottle of wine appeared on the table. He poured a bowl for Yi Xian and said, Try it. Yi Xian didn't hold back and drank it in one gulp. As soon as it entered his stomach, a terrifying energy erupted from within him. but it was quickly absorbed by his body. Yixian was stunned. What's this? Muchen smiled and said, 10,000-year-old wine. There are only 2 jars in the entire Daybreak City. Yixian smiled and said, if you have something to say, then feel free to speak. Muchen shook his head and said, it's nothing. I just want to get to know you. Yixian gazed at Muchen and didn't say anything. Muchen suddenly opened his palm, and 2 wooden tokens appeared in front of Yixian. One was black and the other was white. Muchen said, these are identity tokens. One is for Daybreak City, and the other is for Eternal Night City. Sire can freely enter and exit Daybreak City and Eternal Night City. Not only that, both identities can provide young lord with some convenience. Yixian smiled and said, I don't understand why you're doing this. Muchen smiled and said, young master isn't an ordinary person. I just want to form a good relationship with you, that's all. Yixian thought for a moment and said, I want to find out something. Muchen nodded and said, go on, young master. Yixian said, who's the most monstrous genius in the younger generation of Daybreak City? Muchen glanced at Yixian and said, Tianchen. Yixian smiled and said, can you tell me about it? Muchen thought for a moment and said, do you know about the divine rankings? Yixian nodded and said, Miss Tianyan told me about it just now. Is he the first on the divine rankings? Muchen smiled and said, no. Yixian frowned slightly and said, then? Muchen said softly, he isn't the first on the divine rankings, but he defeated the first. On the other hand, he merely used less than a year to attain prana transformation from the telekinesis realm. Prana transformation. Yixian's expression was calm when he heard this, and he smiled and said, he's attained prana transformation already? Muchen nodded and said, he and the Defiance of Eternal Night City are the most monstrous geniuses of this era. Someone has investigated them, and no matter if it's Eternal Night City or Daybreak City, their levels of monstrous geniuses are unprecedented. Now that the Defiant of Eternal Night City has returned, these 2 monstrous geniuses will fight sooner or later, and it might even be a battle between Daybreak City and Eternal Night City. Yixian nodded slightly and said, I understand. As soon as he finished speaking, he drank another bowl of wine and said, farewell. As soon as he finished speaking, he stood up and left. However, he glanced at the right before he left. Muchen didn't ask him to stay. A woman appeared here after Yixian left, and she sat before Muchen and said, he noticed me. Muchen grinned and said, what's so surprising about that? The woman gazed at Muchen and said, big brother, why did you become friends with him? Muchen gazed at her and smiled, little girl, what do you think of him? The woman hesitated for a moment and shook her head, he's just a circle breaker. I can't see anything extraordinary about him. Muchen said softly, he's extraordinary in every way. The woman looked at Muchen with a puzzled expression. Muchen smiled and said, first, you should know Miss Tianyan's character. She doesn't treat anyone well, but her attitude towards this brother is very different. It's not exactly respectful, but it's at least polite. Second, when Elder Yu came to cause trouble for Miss Tianyan, he just watched from the side without a trace of fear. What does that mean? It means he doesn't respect Elder Yu at all. As he spoke, he picked up the bowl of wine in front of him and drank a mouthful. Then he continued, third, do you see the young man beside him? That young man was in the Daoming realm, and he obviously came from another place. This kind of person would definitely be a top-notch monstrous existence in other places, but he was very respectful to this brother, and that kind of respect was not fake. This kind of top monstrous genius will only respect those who are more monstrous than them. The fourth point. When I said that I wanted to befriend him and form a good relationship with him, he didn't seem surprised or suspicious at all. Why? Because he thinks it's a normal thing to do. As he spoke, his expression gradually turned solemn. Finally, he asked me about the most monstrous genius in Daylight City. Most people wouldn't ask such a question. Only the top monstrous geniuses would. Because they're only interested in people of the same level, just like Tianqin is only interested in contravening ones. Moreover, when I mentioned contravening ones and Tianqin, did you see his expression? Not only was he calm, but he was also smiling. That smile was filled with interest. In other words, he's interested in Tianqin. Hearing that, the woman's expression gradually turned solemn. Muchen smiled and said, this is a top genius from another world. The woman said in a deep voice, brother, how can a genius from another world fight Tianqin and contravening ones? Muchen shook his head. Girl, how big is the universe? How big are Daylight City and Eternal Night City? Even Tian Chen and contravening ones wouldn't dare to say they're the most monstrous genius in the entire universe, let alone us. After a moment of silence, the woman said, "Then brother, why don't you bring him to our daylight city?" Mu Qin said softly, "It's stupid to bring him here. Mu Jin, ask the people in the city to make things easier for Lady Tianyan and the young man who just joined our city." The woman nodded and said, "I understand." After saying that, she stood up and left. Mu Qin looked out the window in the distance thinking about something. After Yi Xian left the restaurant, he left the Baizhou city directly. However, not long after, he frowned. At that moment, the space in front of him trembled slightly. The next moment, an old man appeared in front of him. This old man was the elder Yu who had appeared in the restaurant before. Yi Xian looked at elder Yu and said with a smile, "Sir, are you looking for the wrong person?" Elder Yu stared at Yi Xian and said, "I'm not looking for the wrong person. I'm looking for you." Yi Xian was puzzled. "Why are you looking for me?" Elder Yu said coldly, "Aren't you in cahoots with Tianyan?" Yi Xian was stunned. Then he smiled and said, "Tianyan killed your son. You should be looking for her. This has nothing to do with me. It doesn't make sense for you to look for me." Elder Yu stared at Yi Xian and said, "You're weaker." Yi Xian was stunned. The next moment he raised his left thumb. Before Elder Yu could react, a sword pierced through his forehead. Elder Yu looked at Yi Xian in disbelief. "You," Yi Xian smiled and said, "Do you still think I'm a little brother?" Chapter 2051. At this moment, Elder Yu was completely stunned. He hadn't imagined that he would actually be instantly killed by this young man. After all, this young man was merely at the breakthrough realm. Such a realm of cultivation was like an ant to him. Yet now he'd actually been instantly killed. Yi Xian didn't waste his breath on Elder Yu. The green sword absorbed Elder Yu's soul. Yi Xian gazed silently at the green sword in his grasp. He'd utilized the green sword just now because he wanted to kill Elder Yu with a single strike. But he noticed that it wasn't necessary at all. Even though Elder Yu was at the Dao Radiance realm, he was actually very weak. So, he should have been able to instantly kill Elder Yu even if he didn't utilize the green sword. Of course, besides his own strength, there was another reason, and it was because the old man had underestimated him. Since the beginning, Elder Yu hadn't taken him seriously at all. Under such circumstances and coupled with the fact that he was so close to Elder Yu, Qin Shi had killed Elder Yu with a single strike. Yi Xian was about to leave when a shapeless pressure suddenly descended from the sky. Yi Xian frowned slightly. In the next moment, an old man appeared before Yi Xian. He was from Daybreak City. The old man gazed at Yi Xian. "You're from Eternal Night City." Yi Xian shook his head. "No." The old man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then why did you kill a member of my Daybreak City?" Yi Xian smiled. "He wanted to kill me, so I was forced to retaliate." The old man stared at Yi Xian silently, but his eyes were filled with vigilance. Right at this moment, a man appeared here. It was Mu Qin. Mu Qin glanced at Yi Xian and laughed bitterly. "Young Master Yi, I never expected that we would meet again so soon." Yi Xian shrugged. "I'm innocent. Elder Yu had a conflict with Miss Tianyan, so he vented his anger on me. I told him that I had nothing to do with the conflict between him and Miss Tianyan, but he wouldn't listen. Not only did he refuse to listen, he even tried to hit me. So I was forced to retaliate." Forced to retaliate. The corners of Mu Chen's mouth twitched. The old man's expression was extremely unsightly. Mu Chen suddenly said, "Elder Pavilion, go back." The old man hesitated for a moment before saying, "Second young master, this matter?" Mu Chen said, "I'll handle it." The old man hesitated for a moment, and he was just about to leave. Right at this moment, another man appeared here, and his appearance was slightly similar to Mu Chen. The elder bowed slightly to the man. "Young master." This person was the eldest son of White Day City's city lord, Mu Qian. The man said with a smile, "Second brother, we can't just let this matter go." As he spoke, he looked at Yi Xian and said, "This man killed an elder of Daybreak City. I suspect that he is from Evernight City." Mu Qian frowned slightly. It was Elder Yu who found trouble with him first. Mu Qian smiled. "Second brother, are you from Daybreak City?" After a moment of silence, Mu Qian turned around and looked at Yi Xian. "Young Master Yi, you can leave." Mu Qian narrowed his eyes. "What's wrong, second brother? Are you colluding with the people of Evernight City?" Mu Qian fell silent. He didn't explain because he knew that it was impossible to explain clearly to an idiot. Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly chuckled and said, "I'm not from Evernight City." Mu Qian gazed at Yi Xian. Do you think you can just because you say so? Yi Xian grinned. He came looking for trouble with me first. Mu Qian stared at Yi Xian. Then you killed him? Yi Xian nodded, yes. Mu Qian's eyes narrowed slightly. You're very arrogant. Yi Xian chuckled. I can't just stand by and do nothing if he wants to kill me, right? Mu Qian smiled. You said that he wanted to kill you. Do you have any proof? Yi Xian blinked. Do you intend to be unreasonable? A wisp of disdain arose on the corners of Mu Qian's mouth. Reason? In this world, the one with the bigger fist is the one in the right. Yi Xian suddenly flicked his thumb lightly. Before Mu Qian could even react, his head was directly sliced off, and a stream of blood spurted out from his neck like a fountain. Seeing this scene, Mu Qian's pupils constricted slightly. He knew that Yi Xian was very strong, but he didn't know that Yi Xian was strong to this extent. After all, his big brother was also at the Daoming realm. And a Daoming realm expert was killed just like that? The old man's expression changed greatly. He looked at Yi Xian, his eyes filled with vigilance. Yi Xian glanced at Mu Qian, who only had a soul left, and smiled. I'm being reasonable because I'm benevolent towards you, not because I'm afraid of you. Do you understand? Mu Qian, who was already a soul, stared at Yi Xian. My father is the Daybreak City's city lord, and he's also an embodiment transformation realm expert. Yi Xian frowned. I hate second generations like you the most in my life. You only know how to rely on your parents every day. Can you learn from me? Look at me, I don't rely on my father, I rely on my sister. Xiaotao was speechless. Mu Qian gazed at Yi Xian. Sir, I believe that this is a misunderstanding. However, Yi Xian shook his head. It's too late. As soon as he finished speaking, the green profound sword suddenly entered Mu Qian's soul, and then Mu Qian was instantly absorbed completely. Yi Xian opened his palm, and the green profound sword returned to his grasp before he turned around and left. Suddenly, countless formidable auras shot into the sky from the distant Daybreak City. Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly vanished on the spot, and he vanished into the horizon in the blink of an eye. The old man and Mu Qian were stunned when they saw this scene. He fled just like that? Meanwhile, a few dozen experts appeared here, and they were led by a middle-aged man. The middle-aged man gazed towards the horizon. He's from Eternal Night City? Mu Qian shook his head and sighed softly. He isn't from Eternal Night City, but that might not be the case now. The middle-aged man frowned slightly, and he remained silent for a moment before he said, After him. As soon as he finished speaking, he immediately led all the experts in pursuit. Meanwhile, Shintong and Heavenly Loath appeared here as well. Heavenly Loath glanced towards the distance, and then she gazed at Mu Qian. Are all of you pursuing King Kaoshan? Mu Qian frowned slightly. King Kaoshan? Heavenly Loath said, That's Yi Xian. Mu Qian hesitated for a moment and asked, Miss Heavenly Loath, what exactly is the background of this young Master Yi? Heavenly Loath stared at Mu Qian. Let me ask you, are all of you pursuing him? Mu Qian nodded. He killed Elder Yu and my older brother just now. Alas. Heavenly Loath shook her head. Idiot. As she spoke, she suddenly opened her palm and a command token appeared there. It was the identity token of Daybreak City. Heavenly Loath pointed with her finger, and the command token flew over to Mu Qian. Mu Qian was puzzled. Miss Heavenly Loath, you? Heavenly Loath spoke indifferently. From this moment onward, I don't belong to Daybreak City. Mu Qian was astounded. Miss Heavenly Loath, you? Heavenly Loath didn't waste her breath at all, and she just turned around and left. Meanwhile, Mu Qian hurriedly stood in front of Heavenly Loath and he gazed at her. Miss Heavenly Loath, why? Heavenly Loath glanced at Mu Qian. Why? Because all of you are courting death. Mu Qian spoke in a low voice. Why do you say that? Heavenly Loath spoke indifferently. That idiot Elder Yu will get all of you killed. As for you, if your influence is great enough, then I advise you to use it and stop the members of Daybreak City from pursuing him. Otherwise you'll regret it. No, it's your Daybreak City that will regret it. As soon as she finished speaking, she vanished into the distance. God Eye hesitated for a moment, and then he returned the command token to Mu Qian before he vanished into the horizon as well. Mu Qian remained silent for a moment on the spot, and then he said, Investigate. Investigate his background. As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and left. It didn't take long for Mu Qian to arrive at a pavilion in the city, and he bowed slightly to the pavilion. Grandfather. There was no reply from the pavilion. Mu Qian said again, Grandfather. A long time later, a voice resounded from within. Speak. Mu Qian spoke in a low voice. Moments later, the voice rang out once more. Not interested. Mu Qin laughed wryly. Grandfather, this matter concerns the survival of Daybreak City. The voice within the pavilion said, You worry too much. You're too cautious. Besides, the other party has killed 2 people from Daybreak City, including your elder brother. His actions are a clear sign of contempt for our city. Whether he's from Evernight or not, he must be killed. Otherwise, how will the others in the city look at us? Mu Qin remained silent. The voice continued, Moreover, if we don't kill this person and allow him to join Evernight, won't our Daybreak City gain another powerful enemy? Little fellow, things have come to this. Since we've already offended him, we must kill him and not seek peace. Besides, will he join Daybreak City if you seek peace? He won't. There's already a rift between him and Daybreak City, understand? Mu Qin didn't say anything. The voice continued, You may leave. Mu Qin bowed slightly, then turned to leave. Mu Qin arrived in front of a stone staircase and gazed at the distant horizon, feeling uneasy. Both Yi Xian's and Heaven's Malice's attitudes made him feel that this matter wasn't as simple as it seemed. Could an ordinary power nurture a terrifying genius like Yi Xian? That was obviously impossible. This also meant that there was a terrifying superpower behind Yi Xian. This power was an uncertain factor. Mu Qin gazed at the distant horizon, his eyes filled with deep worry. But at this moment he was powerless to change anything. Just as his grandfather had said, there was no room for compromise at this point. On the other side, Yi Xian was riding on his sword, pushing his speed to the limit. Behind him was a group of powerful Dao Brightness Realm experts. He wasn't afraid of them, but he was afraid of being ganged up on. Moreover, he had been standing right in front of Daybreak City's gates. If they were to fight, that place would be disadvantageous to him. Before long, Yi Xian arrived in the vast starry skies. Yi Xian looked around. The next moment he headed straight for the Evernight realm. Behind him, the middle-aged man stared into the distance. He's going to the Evernight realm. Stop him. As soon as he finished speaking, he raised his speed to the limit, and the experts behind him also increased their speed. At the end of the starry skies, a black-robed elder suddenly appeared in front of Yi Xian. The black-robed elder narrowed his eyes. Who are you? Yi Xian hurriedly said, The Daybreak realm is attacking. Quick, call someone out to kill them. The black-robed elder. Chapter 2052. Dayday City is attacking? The black-robed old man was slightly stunned when he heard Yi Xian, and then his expression instantly changed when he looked behind Yi Xian. After that, he turned around and vanished on the spot. Yi Xian was stunned. Did he flee? Right at this moment, the black-robed old man appeared in front of him again, and there were actually over 100 people behind the old man. All of them were at the Daoming realm. Yi Xian's eyelids twitched when he witnessed this scene. Eternal Night City is quite ferocious. They were able to gather so many experts in such a short period of time. Meanwhile, the middle-aged man who led the group from Dayday City's forces stopped moving, and he spoke solemnly when he saw the experts of Eternal Night City behind Yi Xian. You really are from Eternal Night City. Yi Xian smiled. As you wish. The middle-aged man took a deep and long glance at Yi Xian, and then he gazed at the black-robed old man by Yi Xian's side. Chu Xiu, good job. As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and led the others away. They had no other choice but to attack Yi Xian just like that because he'd fled to Eternal Night City, right? At this moment, Yi Xian, who was in the distance, suddenly attacked. Boom. A sword howl resounded, and then a flying sword slashed through the battlefield. The middle-aged man's pupils constricted, and then he swiftly turned around and smashed his fist forward. Bang! An expanse of light erupted, and then the middle-aged man was blasted over 30 kilometers away. Moreover, his body was instantly blasted into pieces as soon as he stopped moving. Both sides were stunned when they witnessed this scene. Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly shouted, Kill them! As soon as he finished speaking, he charged forward. Chu Xiu and the others were stunned by this scene. Do we fight? Chu Xiu and the others practically didn't hesitate to charge forward as well. Because the experts of Dayday City had charged towards Yi Xian as soon as Yi Xian had charged forward. However, Yi Xian hadn't charged forward, and he charged forward for a moment before retreating towards Chu Xiu and the others. The battle began. It had to be said that this battle had come too suddenly. No one was mentally prepared for it. They could only fight. Of course, both sides wanted to fight. At this moment, it could be said that when enemies met, their eyes were exceptionally red. Yi Xian did not slip away right away. Instead, he kept a sneak attack. He flicked his thumb from time to time, and every time he flicked his thumb, a strong man from the Daylight City would be beheaded. In less than a few breaths of time, nearly 7 Dao Ming realm experts were killed. In the distance, the middle-aged man in the lead noticed this scene, and his expression changed drastically. Retreat. 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 The experts of Daybreak City retreated as they fought, because they had also discovered how terrifying Yi Xian was. They couldn't block Yi Xian's flying sword at all. As for the experts of Evernight City, they became more and more excited as they fought, because they had completely suppressed the experts of Daybreak City. Yi Xian suddenly said, "Don't let them escape." As he spoke, another flying sword slashed out. In the distance, a Dao Ming realm expert wasn't able to dodge in time, and his forehead was pierced by Yi Xian's sword while his soul was instantly absorbed by the green profound sword. He was using the green profound sword this time because he wanted to kill. Moreover, these people were great nourishment for the green profound sword, so he naturally couldn't miss it. The middle-aged man gazed at Yi Xian with astonishment. "You?" Yi Xian suddenly gazed at the middle-aged man. The middle-aged man's expression changed drastically, and he was just about to leave when a sword slashed towards him. The middle-aged man was horrified, and he clenched his right fist tightly before smashing it forward. Even though it was only his soul, the strength behind this punch was still terrifying. Formidable energy surged out from his fist, and in an instant the space in front of him started to seethe. Unfortunately, his opponent was Yi Xian, and it was Yi Xian who was using the green profound sword. As the green profound sword slashed down, the middle-aged man's formidable energy was instantly dispersed. Bang! A huge amount of energy was instantly dispersed, and then the green profound sword pierced through the middle-aged man's forehead. Bang! The middle-aged man didn't even have the chance to speak before he was completely absorbed by the green profound sword. Yi Xian opened his palm, and the green profound sword returned to his hand. He glanced into the distance and was about to attack again when an extremely terrifying pressure suddenly assaulted him from the horizon. Yi Xian's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked up into the sky. In the next moment, the sky split open, and a middle-aged man in a luxurious robe walked out. A praxis transformation expert. This person was the current city lord of Dayday City, Mu Su. Yi Xian sheathed the green profound sword and silently retreated to the side. With Mu Su's appearance, the experts of Eternal Night City stopped one after another. Even though they wanted to kill the members of Dayday City, they weren't stupid. A praxis transformation expert wasn't someone they could resist. Meanwhile, the space in the sky above Chu Xiu and the others suddenly split open, and then a man in a black robe walked out. He was also a praxis transformation expert. This person was the city lord of Eternal Night City, Han Jiang. The city lords of both sides had appeared. In the distance, Mu Su's expression was extremely gloomy. Because Dayday City had actually lost 18 Dao Ming realm experts since the beginning. On the other hand, not a single person from Eternal Night City had died. 0 for 18. What a huge loss. Mu Su's gaze was sharp as a sword as he looked at Yi Xian who was hiding behind the crowd. Yi Xian looked at Mu Su and smiled lightly. "I'm sorry. I didn't hold back and killed to my heart's content, causing you to lose so many experts. I'm deeply sorry for that." As he spoke, he even bowed slightly. The expressions of the experts of Dayday City instantly became ferocious when they witnessed this scene. He was trying to kill someone. Mu Su raised his right hand slightly and grabbed at Yi Xian from afar. This grab caused the space where Yi Xian stood to distort into a strange vortex, and within the vortex, Yi Xian felt a myriad of forces tearing him apart. Fortunately, he'd released his aura and sword aura right from the beginning. Otherwise, he would have probably been shattered into countless pieces the moment Mu Su attacked. But even then, his aura and sword aura were gradually vanishing. Yi Xian's brows knit together slightly, and he was about to attack. However, the city governor of Eternal Night City, Han Jiang, suddenly flicked his sleeve, and then the space Yi Xian resided in instantly returned to normal. Mu Su looked at Han Jiang. "Han Jiang, he doesn't seem to be from Eternal Night City." Han Jiang roared with laughter. "So what? All I know is that he was killing people from Dayday City just now. As long as he's an enemy of Dayday City, then he's a friend of Eternal Night City. Haven't you heard that the enemy of my enemy is my friend?" Ah. Mu Su's eyes narrowed slightly, and they flickered with ghastly killing intent. Han Jiang smiled. "Mu Su, with me here, don't even think about killing this little friend today. If you want to fight, we can fight right now. However, you have to think it through. We have this little friend here, and he can kill a Dao Ming realm expert with 2 strikes of his sword." Yi Xian suddenly smiled. "Let me correct you, it's 1 strike of his sword." Han Jiang was slightly stunned, and then he roared with laughter. Yes, 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 it's one strike of his sword. I was mistaken. Ah, Han Jiang, right? Mu Su's expression was extremely unsightly. To fight or not to fight? Of course not. If Yi Xian joined forces with Eternal Night City, then they were at an absolute disadvantage. Mu Su looked at Yi Xian. What enmity does Day City have with you? Yi Xian frowned. Don't you know? Mu Su's eyes narrowed. Know what? Yi Xian smiled. Let young Master Mu Chen tell you. Mu Chen. Mu Su hesitated for a moment and then he turned around. Meanwhile, Mu Chen appeared, and he glanced at Yi Xian with a complicated expression. He didn't conceal anything and told Yi Xian everything. After knowing the ins and outs of the matter, Mu Su's face instantly turned extremely ugly. Mu Chen. He hadn't expected that this matter was caused by his eldest son. And that elder Yu, it was a conflict within the sect. If you have any enmity, you can look for heaven's hatred. Why should he look for Yi Xian? An elder Yu's son. What kind of trash is he? Actually, he was quite annoyed at this moment. Yi Xian wasn't an enemy of Day City. But now Day City had forcefully turned him into an enemy. Moreover, it was because of an idiot like Elder Yu. It wasn't worth it. Of course, there was no turning back now. Even if Day City was willing to turn back, Yi Xian wouldn't turn back. If Yi Xian turned back now, then Eternal Night City would just ignore everything. Wouldn't that be a pain in the ass for Yi Xian? Mu Su glanced at Yi Xian. I never expected that another super genius would appear in this world. As he spoke, he glanced at Han Jiang. Congratulations. Han Jiang laughed heartily. This is an unexpected surprise. To Eternal Night City, this was indeed a pleasant surprise. They had already witnessed Yi Xian's terrifying strength. Such a monstrous genius was actually forced to Eternal Night City by Day City. Thinking of this, Han Jiang couldn't help but laugh. Mu Su glanced at Han Jiang and smiled. It's best to have the last laugh. Han Jiang smiled. Then let's see who will have the last laugh. Mu Su smiled. We'll wait and see. As he spoke, he glanced at Yi Xian in the distance and turned to leave. The experts of Day City also left. After Mu Su and the others left, Han Jiang looked at Yi Xian. He sized up Yi Xian and smiled. How should I address you? Yi Xian smiled. Yi Xian. Han Jiang was slightly stunned. Yi Xian? Yi Xian blinked. Senior, do you know me? Han Jiang said in a deep voice. Yes. Yi Xian frowned. How is that possible? Han Jiang smiled faintly and did not speak. At this time Yi Xian suddenly said, Defying one. Han Jiang nodded. After he came back he said that he met a very strong monster and that was you. At that time I didn't think much of it. I never expected that you would come here. Of course, I didn't expect that young Master Yi would be so monstrous. As expected of someone who could fight a defying one evenly. As he spoke, he glanced at the people of Eternal Night City and said angrily, What are you waiting for? Greetings, young Master Yi. Oh no, from now on, young Master Yi is the Deputy City Lord of Eternal Night City. Greetings, Deputy City Lord. Don't just stand there. Hurry up and salute. Everyone. Chapter 2053. Deputy City Lord. Everyone was slightly taken aback by Han Jiang's words. He became a Deputy City Lord just like that? They didn't think too much about it and bowed. They were all old foxes. How could they not understand Han Jiang's meaning? Of course, the young man before them was worth Han Jiang's effort. After all, Yi Xian had killed those Daoming realm experts like he was slaughtering chickens. His strength was too terrifying. Yi Xian was speechless. He had become a Deputy City Lord just like that? Han Jiang appeared before Yi Xian and said with a smile, My Deputy City Lord, let's go. Let's go to Eternal Night City. Yi Xian was speechless. At this moment, Heaven Loathe and God Eye suddenly appeared. Han Jiang frowned when he saw them. From Daybreak City? Yi Xian said hurriedly, My friend. Han Jiang laughed. So you're a friend of the Deputy City Lord. Then you're a friend of Eternal Night City. Deputy City Lord. Heaven Loathe looked at Yi Xian. You've become a Deputy City Lord? Yi Xian nodded. Heaven Loathe was speechless. At this time, God's Eye said, Brother Yi, after we learned that you were being pursued by Daylight City, we retreated from Daylight City now. Heaven Loathe suddenly said, Yes, Daybreak City offered us 2-star veins but we didn't accept them. God Eye's expression froze. He looked at Heaven Loathe in shock. 2-star veins. Yi Xian glanced at Heaven Loathe. The corners of his mouth twitched. This woman's appetite was too big. Eternal Night City probably wouldn't give them 2-star veins easily. After all, they were too precious. As expected, Han Jiang's smile faded when he heard Heaven Loath's words. Actually, he only valued Yi Xian. As for Heaven Loath and God Eye, while they were good, Yi Xian was better. If it was Yi Xian, he would be willing to give them 3 or 4 star veins, not to mention 2. After all, this was a super demon that was comparable to the Defying Ones. On the other hand, the expressions of the Tao Brightness Realm experts from Eternal Night City turned slightly unsightly when they heard Heaven Hateful. They were all 10,000-year-old monsters. How could they not understand White Vexation's intentions? If it was a monster like Yi Xian, Han Jiang would give him 2 star veins. After all, he was a super monster who could be compared to the Defying Ones. But what about Heaven's Loathing and God's Eye? If they could get 2 star veins just like that, what would they, who had been struggling in the city of Evernight for so many years, amount to? Some of the Dao Ming realm powerhouses had undisguised anger on their faces. Heaven Hateful's face darkened. She knew she had messed things up. She looked at Yi Xian with a trace of apology in her eyes, as well as a trace of worry. She was worried that Yi Xian would be angry and blame her for playing tricks. The surroundings suddenly fell silent, and the atmosphere became slightly awkward. At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly grabbed Han Jiang's arm and smiled. "City Governor Han, these are all trivial matters. Let's talk about it later. We're all family. There's nothing we can't talk about. What do you think?" Han Jiang glanced at Yi Xian and smiled. "Indeed. Let's talk about it slowly. Let's talk about it slowly. Let's go back to Evernight City." Back to Evernight City? They returned to Evernight City. Unlike Day City, Evernight City was gloomy all year round, and it carried an oppressive feeling. Yi Xian was actually quite curious about Day City and Evernight City, because his intuition told him that the 2 cities were definitely related. However, he didn't ask about it. Han Jiang dismissed everyone, and then he led Yi Xian's group to the city walls of Evernight City. Han Jiang smiled. "Young friend Yi, I'll get straight to the point." As he spoke, he glanced at Heavenly Hateful and Heavenly Hateful. "Both of you are at the Tao Radiance realm, and you're very outstanding. I should say that you're extremely outstanding. However, I can't give you 2 star veins. At least, I can't give them to you right now. Because just like Day City, there are certain requirements to obtain star veins. Those fellows from before have been struggling here for a very long time, and some have even struggled for over 1,000 years. However, they still haven't obtained star veins. If I were to give them to you as soon as the 2 of you arrive, then those fellows down below wouldn't be convinced." Heavenly Hateful nodded slightly. "What I said just now was rude. I'm sorry." Han Jiang smiled. "I can understand how you feel. Because I came from the Tao Radiance realm as well." As he spoke, he gazed at Yi Xian and smiled. "Young friend Yi, if you need star veins, then I can give them to you." Yi Xian thought for a moment and said, "Let's do it according to the rules." Han Jiang heaved a sigh of relief when he heard this. He could break the rules for Yi Xian, but it would make many others feel uncomfortable, and it wasn't good for the unity of Eternal Night City. Because he knew that if he gave Yi Xian star veins, then Yi Xian would definitely give them to Heavenly Hateful and God Eye. Of course, if Yi Xian used it for himself, then it would definitely not be like that. After all, Yi Xian's strength was here, so no one would go against it. Besides that, if Heavenly Hateful and God Eye obtained star veins in such a way, then they would definitely be ostracized in Eternal Night City. Yi Xian gazed at Heavenly Hateful and God Eye. "Are both of you confident?" God Eye hesitated for a moment and said, "I'm not very confident." Yi Xian's face darkened. Heavenly Hateful suddenly said, "If others can do it, then so can we." Yi Xian chuckled and then he gazed at Han Jiang. "Let me make some calculations. I killed 10 Tao Radiance Realm experts just now. What other requirements do I have to fulfill in order to obtain a star vein?" Han Jiang smiled. "Our mission is different from Daybreak Cities. Besides killing 10 Tao Radiance Realm experts, we also have to kill a Tao Radiance Realm expert who's ranked in the top 20 of the Divine rankings. Of course, that middle-aged man who led the group you killed just now was ranked in the top 20 of the Divine rankings." Yi Xian smiled. "In other words, I've already passed?" Han Jiang smiled. "There's another requirement, and it's to serve Eternal Night City." Yi Xian frowned when he heard this. Meanwhile, Han Jiang suddenly smiled. "Of course, young brother Yi doesn't need that." As he spoke, he opened his palm and a spatial ring descended to Yi Xian. There just happened to be a star vein within it. Yi Xian didn't refuse and immediately put it away. "Thank you." As he spoke, he seemed to have thought of something and asked, "What about the Defying Ones?" Han Jiang looked up into the starry sky. "They should be fighting Tianqian right now." "Fighting?" Yi Xian frowned slightly. "They're fighting?" Han Jiang nodded. As soon as he came back, he asked Tianxian to fight. Young brother Yi, are you interested? Yi Xian smiled, of course. In fact, he also wanted to fight. He had reached a bottleneck and only fighting could improve him. Han Jiang smiled, then you might have to wait. Yi Xian was a little curious, aren't you going to keep an eye on them? Han Jiang shook his head, both of them are arrogant and won't let us follow them. Of course, both of us aren't idle either. We're both paying attention to the top experts on both sides. Whichever expert disappears, both of us will come forward to stop it. Yi Xian nodded, understood. Han Jiang smiled and said, before this, neither of us could do anything to the other. But now, with your participation, under the power of embodiment transformation, we have the absolute advantage. Of course, I don't know if Daybreak City has any other trump cards. Yi Xian said with a smile, forget about them. City Governor Han, I want to enter into closed-door cultivation for some time. Han Jiang nodded, all right. Let me know if you need anything. As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and left. Meanwhile, Heaven Hater spoke abruptly, I'm sorry. Yi Xian gazed at Heaven Hater, what are you sorry for? Heaven Hater glanced at Yi Xian, you know what I mean. Yi Xian chuckled. He naturally understood that Heaven Hater had played a trick and wanted to use him to obtain a star vein from Daybreak City. Needless to say, such actions were very inappropriate. Yi Xian smiled, it's nothing. As he spoke, he glanced at them and said, now both of you've joined Eternal Night City. Moreover, both of you joined Daybreak City before this. So, the people of the city more or less have different opinions about both of you. Of course, all of that is nothing. In short, remember not to cause trouble. But if someone tries to bully you on purpose, then don't hold it in. Actually, he was very clearly aware that rather than saying that Heaven Hater and Han Jiang had joined Eternal Night City, it would be more accurate to say that they were following him, Yi Xian. Han Jiang understood this as well. However, he was a smart man, so he didn't say anything about it. Heaven Hater nodded, I understand. Yi Xian continued, I can't give you the star vein. You have to fight for it. We have to rely on ourselves. Heaven Hater glanced at Yi Xian with a strange expression on his face. Yi Xian glared at Heaven Hater, what's with that look? Heaven Hater puckered his lips and didn't speak. Since she was in the wrong today, she didn't want to hurt Yi Xian's feelings. Yi Xian glanced at them, I'm going into closed-door cultivation. Both of you go familiarize yourselves with the city. As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and left. Heaven Hater remained silent for a moment before he turned around and left. Yi Xian returned to Xiao Ta and placed the star vein in Xiao Ta's body. He had to admit that with the appearance of the star vein, the spiritual qi in Xiao Ta's body became different. The spiritual qi was extremely dense. Yi Xian was a little shocked as he looked at the star aura that permeated the surroundings. No wonder so many powerhouses wanted star veins. The spirit aura of this star vein was different from other spirit auras. It was very pure. At this time, Yi Xian seemed to have thought of something. He suddenly asked, Xiao Ta, why don't you look shocked when I put the star vein in? Xiao Ta said calmly, why should I be shocked? Yi Xian frowned, this is the star vein. Xiao Ta was silent for a moment. Then he said, young master, you have to understand that Little White used to live here. Yi Xian didn't understand, what do you mean? Xiao Ta sighed softly, Little White is the ancestor of all spirits. With her around, any star vein is nothing. Do you understand? Yi Xian was speechless. Xiao Ta continued, I, Xiao Ta, have seen all kinds of spiritual qi. Although this star vein is not bad, how can I be interested in it? Only someone like you who hasn't seen the world would go crazy for it. If it were me, I wouldn't even want a star vein of this level. Yi Xian's face darkened. Chapter 2054. Needless to say, Yi Xian often wanted to kill this Xiao Ta. He was too good at acting cool. Ignoring Xiao Ta, Yi Xian sat down cross-legged and slowly closed his eyes. The previous battle was delightful. When he used the green profound sword, the Daoming realm powerhouses were like ants to him, one sword for one. However, he could not underestimate the Incarnation realm powerhouses. Of course, he also wanted to fight with the Incarnation realm powerhouses. If Han Jiang had not stopped him, he would have fought with Mu Su. After a while, Yi Xian looked at the green profound sword in his hand and shook his head with a bitter smile. At this moment he could finally understand the helplessness of his big brother. Invincible, that feeling was not particularly good. Because the current him wanted someone to defeat him. Only by being defeated could he find his own shortcomings and then change them. Invincible? This feeling was not comfortable. Yi Xian got up, shook his head and sighed, "Xiaota, to be honest, I miss the days when I was beaten up every day. Those days, although bitter, were very fulfilling and it made me want to improve. Not like now, invincible makes me lonely and empty." After a moment of silence, Xiaota said, "Young master, is it fun to act cool in front of a tower?" Yi Xian laughed and turned to leave. He decided to find Han Jiang for a spar. Daoming realm? He no longer had any interest in it. Now his small goal was to kill one incarnation realm with one sword. As soon as Yi Xian left Xiaota, Han Jiang appeared in front of him. Han Jiang's expression was grave. Yi Xian frowned slightly. "What's wrong?" Han Jiang said in a deep voice, "Dayu City does not follow the rules." Yi Xian was a little surprised. "What do you mean?" Han Jiang's face was pale. "I just received a signal from the Defying One. He is in danger." Yi Xian was slightly taken aback. Then he said, "In danger?" Han Jiang nodded. "It must be Dayu City's doing." Yi Xian said in a deep voice, "Did their people make a move?" Han Jiang said solemnly, "We have been keeping an eye on their experts. No one has left Daybreak City." Yi Xian frowned. "In other words, they have other people?" Han Jiang nodded. "They still have experts that we don't know about." Yi Xian continued, "What about us? We should have them too, right?" Han Jiang shook his head. "We didn't." Yi Xian's expression froze. Han Jiang smiled bitterly. "I really didn't. Moreover, I still feel that this matter is a little strange because according to what I know, there are only a total of 6 embodiment transformation realm experts in Daytime City, and those 6 are currently in Daytime City. You must know, every time an embodiment transformation realm expert appears, it is basically not enough. Breaking through from the Daoming realm to the embodiment transformation realm, that movement is too big." Yi Xian said solemnly, "What else did the Defying One say?" Han Jiang shook his head. "After he sent a message asking for help, we couldn't contact him anymore. You know his personality. If it was a one-on-one battle, even if he died, he would not ask for help from us. There must be other experts in Daytime City making a move." Yi Xian thought about it and said, "You want me to go?" Han Jiang nodded with a gloomy expression. "Right now, we are all restrained by the experts of Daytime City. Anyone who leaves will be stopped." As he said, he looked at Yi Xian. "Little friend Yi, you are now an extra person on our side. Only you can leave Daytime City. Moreover, Daytime City doesn't dare to stop you because we will restrain their current embodiment transformation realm experts." Yi Xian asked, "Where is the Defying Ones?" Han Jiang said hurriedly, "The God War realm. That's an ancient battlefield. Our Evernight City and Daybreak City often fought there." Yi Xian looked at Han Jiang. "Don't resist." As he said, he suddenly put his right hand on Han Jiang's shoulder and slowly closed his eyes. "Think of the God War realm." Han Jiang was slightly stunned. He didn't think too much and began to think of the God War realm. A moment later, Yi Xian retracted his right hand. He opened his palm and the profound azure sword appeared in it. In an instant, he disappeared from the spot. Han Jiang was stunned. The next moment, his expression changed drastically. He found that Yi Xian had gone to the God War realm. Han Jiang was silent for a moment and said softly, "This sword is good. Another day I will ask little friend Yi to make some in bulk. This way our Eternal Night City will play with Daytime City to death." "Wonderful." Yi Xian appeared in the God War realm directly. As soon as he entered, he was stunned. This was because he found that this place was filled with the aura of dead spirits and the smell of blood. A normal person might dislike this aura of dead spirits and the smell of blood. However, he didn't dislike it at all. Not only did he not dislike it, but he even felt close to it. Yi Xian glanced around. This place was an abandoned continent. However, the spacetime here was abnormally sturdy. The spacetime density here was at least 10 times thicker than other places. This shocked Yi Xian. He had traveled through countless spacetimes, but this was the first time he had seen such a dense spacetime. Without thinking too much, Yi Xian slowly closed his eyes and scanned the surroundings with his divine sense. With his current strength, his divine sense could instantly cover the entire God War realm. Soon Yi Xian frowned because he didn't find anyone. Was he not here? After a moment of silence, Yi Xian raised his head and looked into the depths of the starry sky. The next moment, he rode on his sword and arrived in the sky above the God War realm in the blink of an eye. Yi Xian glanced around and scanned the surroundings with his divine sense again. A moment later, he frowned again. He still didn't find anyone. Yi Xian said solemnly, "Could this defying walker have already been killed?" Saying so, he shook his head. He knew the strength of a defying walker. To kill this defying walker, it would take at least 3 unfettered embodiment realm cultivators to work together. In the same place, Yi Xian was silent for a moment. He looked at the starry sky around him and calculated in his heart. In the beginning, the defying walker and Tianqin must have fought in the God War realm because he found traces of battle below. In other words, the defying walker must have encountered something and left the God War realm. Escape. Where would the defying walker escape to? As Yi Xian pondered, he looked around. The next moment he rushed in one direction. This direction was the direction to Evernight City. In his opinion, if the defying walker really encountered an undefeatable expert and wanted to escape, it would definitely run in the direction of Evernight City. At this moment, Xiao Ta suddenly said, "Young master," Yi Xian said, "What do you want to say?" After a moment of silence, Xiao Ta said, "Forget it." Yi Xian frowned slightly. "What the hell?" Xiao Ta said, "I don't want to say anything." Yi Xian was speechless. He did not talk nonsense with this Xiao Ta and increased his speed to the limit. God War Realm. Not long after Yi Xian left, the place he was originally at suddenly wriggled. The next moment, a man with disheveled hair emerged from the ground. The man's clothes were shabby and his hair was disheveled. At first glance he looked like a beggar. The man looked up into the starry sky and frowned slightly. "That sword's aura?" Saying so, his eyes suddenly flashed with a fanatical light. "Unknown expert, and a woman's aura, interesting." Saying so, he stuck out his tongue and licked his lips, his eyes obscene. "Women, strong women are the most fun to play with." Ah. At the end of the distant starry sky, Yi Xian flew on his sword. Soon he stopped because he found that the space in front of him was pitch black. There was a battle. Yi Xian frowned slightly. He entered the pitch black space and closed his eyes slightly. His divine consciousness directly swept out. After a while, he opened his eyes and disappeared from where he was. A ray of sword light flashed in this pitch black space. Not long after, Yi Xian suddenly stopped. At this moment he felt an extremely powerful aura. Yi Xian frowned slightly. At this moment, the space-time in front of him suddenly tore open. The next moment, a man rushed out. The person who rushed out was the Defying One's. It has to be said that the Defying One's appearance was a bit miserable. Not only was his body tattered and full of wounds, his right arm was missing. The most terrifying thing was that there was a pure gold arrow stuck in the Defying One's left chest. Seeing the appearance of the Defying Ones, Yi Xian was completely stunned. What happened to this guy? Why was he beaten so badly? Seeing Yi Xian, the Defying Ones was also slightly stunned. The next moment his face changed. "Brother Yi, you're not here to spar with me, are you?" Yi Xian was about to speak, but the Defying Ones hurriedly said, "Brother Yi, now is not the time to spar. Let's spar another day, okay?" Yi Xian's face was full of black lines. "I'm already a member of Eternal Night City." The Defying Ones was stunned. "Eternal Night City?" Yi Xian nodded. "Yes. We're on the same side now." At this moment, the Defying One suddenly grabbed Yi Xian's arm. "Brother Yi, save me." Yi Xian, the Defying Ones was about to say something, but at this moment, the space behind him suddenly split open, and the next moment, a man in white walked out slowly. The man in white held a black bow in his hand, and behind him was a quiver with 6 arrows of 3 different colors. 2 were golden, 3 were black, and 1 was purple. And beside this man stood a man in a black robe and a woman in a purple dress. The man in the black robe held a sheathed long saber in his left hand, and his long hair draped over his shoulders. There was a deep saber scar between his eyebrows. As for the woman in the purple dress, she held a white spear in her right hand. She wore a veil and her eyes were crystal blue, making her look very seductive. Seeing these 3 people, Yi Xian was stunned. All 3 of them were very young, and it was obvious that they were not from White Day City. And if they were not from White Day City, where were they from? At this moment, the man in white looked at Yi Xian, and the next moment, his eyes fell directly on the cyan profound sword in Yi Xian's hand. When he saw the cyan profound sword, he frowned slightly. In the distance, the Defying Ones beside Yi Xian said in a low voice, "Brother Yi, did you come alone?" Yi Xian nodded. "Why, is there a problem?" The Defying Ones hesitated and then said, "Then we can escape." After saying this, he turned and disappeared into the sky. In the same place, Yi Xian was dumbfounded. Chapter 2055. He fled. Yi Xian was dumbfounded by the Defying One's actions. He fled directly? Yi Xian looked at the white-clothed man in the distance, and the white-clothed man looked back at him. "You're not fleeing?" Yi Xian said with a smile. Fleeing? I don't know what fleeing is in my entire life. The white-clothed man nodded slightly. Just now he was just like you. He was so unyielding. As soon as he finished speaking, the man beside him suddenly charged forward and arrived in front of Yi Xian. In the next moment he suddenly drew his saber and slashed. A saber light slashed down. Yi Xian's eyes narrowed slightly, and he used his thumb to lightly lift his sword out of its sheath. He didn't use the green profound sword. As soon as the sword was unsheathed, an extremely terrifying aura swept out and caused the entire starry sky to seethe. However, as the saber slashed down, Yi Xian's aura and sword aura were directly slashed into pieces. Bang! The sword light shattered, and Yi Xian instantly retreated 30 kilometers away. After Yi Xian stopped, he was completely dumbfounded. My opponent actually broke my aura directly? In the distance, the black-robed man suddenly held the saber in his hand with both hands. In the next moment he took a step forward and slashed down with both hands. As soon as the saber slashed down, a 30 kilometers long saber energy suddenly slashed down from the top of Yi Xian's head. The moment the saber slashed down, it carried the momentum of a thunderbolt as if it wanted to slash the entire starry sky into pieces. It was extremely terrifying. The aura contained within it was even stronger than Yi Xian's aura and sword aura. When he saw this, Yi Xian's eyes narrowed slightly, and there was a trace of seriousness in the depths of his eyes. Without giving it any further thought, he flicked his thumb again and a sword suddenly slashed out. After this slash, another slash flew out. However, when Yi Xian slashed out a second time, the man in the distance slashed down once more. When he saw this, Yi Xian's eyelids twitched and he slashed out again. However, the man in front of him immediately slashed out again. Just like that, both of them struck out 8 times in an instant. Boom. Suddenly, an expanse of sword light and saber light shattered in the river of stars, and then the entire river of stars started to be obliterated. This part of the Milky Way could not withstand the power of the two of them. As the two powerful forces erupted, Yi Xian and the black-robed man were pushed back at the same time. Both of them were pushed back several tens of thousands of feet. When the two of them came to a stop, the starry sky for hundreds of thousands of miles around them had turned pitch black. After Yi Xian stopped, there was a trace of seriousness in his eyes, but there was more excitement. Battles could excite him. At this moment, the black-robed man slowly raised the long saber in his right hand. Boom. A black vortex suddenly appeared in the sky above the black-robed man. In the next moment, a bolt of divine lightning suddenly descended from the vortex and entered his saber. Rumble. The long saber shook violently. In an instant, the long saber was covered by the divine lightning and turned into a thunder saber. In the distance, Yi Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. He stared at the hilt of his sword with his left thumb, and then he slowly closed his eyes. At this moment, the surroundings had suddenly fallen silent, and it was like he was the only person in the world. Calm his heart. The sword in Yi Xian's hand suddenly started trembling slightly, and then it emanated a sword howl. The white-clothed man who led the group in the distance frowned slightly when he witnessed this scene. Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly opened his eyes, and then he raised his thumb lightly. Boom. A sword cry suddenly soared into the sky. At the same time, a sword came out of the pitch-black darkness. At the same time, a sword flashed through the pitch-black starry sky. The eyes of the black-robed man who stood in front of Yi Xian narrowed slightly, and then he raised his saber with both hands and swung it down. A strand of saber chi that carried lightning suddenly slashed down from above the black-robed man's head. It was a collision between sword and saber. Bang! The lightning saber chi slashed directly onto Yi Xian's sword. In an instant, the sword was enveloped by an expanse of lightning. But in the next moment, the lightning was torn apart, and then a sword shot straight towards the black-robed man. A trace of shock flashed through the depths of the black-robed man's eyes, and then he raised his saber to block it. Bang! The black-robed man was blasted 30 kilometers away. He just stopped when another flying sword slashed down towards him. A wisp of viciousness flashed through the black-robed man's eyes, and then he suddenly swung his right hand and slashed down with his saber. Bang! An expanse of light erupted in front of him, and then he retreated explosively once more. At practically the exact same moment, another sword slashed down towards him. The black-robed man's eyes narrowed slightly while the corners of his eyes twitched slightly. He held his saber vertically in front of him with both hands. Bang! The saber shook violently, and the powerful force it carried blasted the black-robed man back once more. However, this wasn't the end of it because another flying sword slashed down towards him. The speed of this flying sword was infuriatingly swift. The The black-robed man was utterly unable to attack with his saber, and he could only defend passively. Even if he did attack with his saber, he could only do it in a simple manner, and he didn't have the time to utilize any formidable saber techniques. At the instant when they collided just now, he'd fallen into a slight disadvantage, and it was precisely this disadvantage that allowed Yi Xian to seize the opportunity to force him into a hopeless situation. The slightest carelessness would doom him eternally. In a short period of time, the black-robed man had retreated over 30 kilometers. Moreover, there were a few tens of scars from the sword on his body, and his entire body was dyed red with blood. However, he didn't dare slack off in the slightest because Yi Xian's sword was truly too swift, and the slightest bit of carelessness would cause it to pierce through his head. Just like that, the black-robed man retreated over and over again. At this moment, cracks had appeared on the saber in his hand. On the other side, the white-robed man and woman in a violet dress didn't show any signs of attacking, and they just watched with calm expressions. However, both of them frequently glanced at the green profound sword that hung on the right side of Yi Xian's waist. Right at this moment, the saber in the black-robed man's hand suddenly shattered into pieces. In practically an instant, a sword had instantly arrived between his brows. Right at this moment of life and death, the black-robed man's eyes slowly closed, and then a saber suddenly flew out from between his brows. Bang! At the instant the saber appeared, Yi Xian's sword shattered into pieces. Yi Xian frowned slightly when he witnessed this scene. Because that saber hadn't just destroyed the black-robed man's sword, it had even destroyed the other 3 swords behind the black-robed man's sword. Yi Xian gazed at the saber. It was thin like a cicada's wing, and it seemed to be translucent at first glance. Yi Xian's brows knit together slightly. What saber is that? It looks very formidable. The black-robed man stared fixedly at Yi Xian from afar. You're very strong. You forced me to use my heart saber. Yi Xian was slightly curious. What's a heart saber? The black-robed man frowned slightly. You haven't condensed a heart sword? Yi Xian shook his head. Nope. A trace of disbelief flashed in the black-robed man's eyes. With your strength, how is it possible that you haven't condensed a heart sword? Yi Xian smiled. Can you tell me what a heart saber is? The black-robed man glanced at Yi Xian. A heart saber is a saber that is condensed from one's thoughts. It's also the most suitable saber for oneself because it's a sword that is condensed from one's thoughts. Yi Xian said in a deep voice, one's thoughts can also be condensed into a saber? The black-robed man frowned again. Don't you know? Yi Xian smiled. I don't have a heart sword. However, I have a sister sword. The black-robed man looked at Yi Xian. What sister sword? Yi Xian waved the green profound sword at his waist. My younger sister forged this sword for me. It's called sister sword for short. The black-robed man glanced at Yi Xian's green profound sword and he said in a deep voice, this sword of yours is very extraordinary. However, it's not a heart sword in the end. Meanwhile, the white-robed man spoke abruptly. Hey Yen, don't underestimate this sword. A trace of surprise flashed in the black-robed man's eyes when he heard the white-robed man, and then he looked at the green profound sword in Yi Xian's hand. This time his gaze carried curiosity. In the distance, Yi Xian said with a smile, again. As he spoke, he suddenly charged forward and directly appeared in front of the black-robed man. A wisp of viciousness flashed through the black-robed man's eyes. He issued a command in his heart, and then the heart blade in front of him suddenly flew up and slashed down. Bang! This slash caused Yi Xian's sword to be directly slashed into pieces. Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly drew his sword and slashed. Draw to decide life and death. A divine close combat technique. As soon as Yi Xian drew his sword, over 10,000 overlapped in an instant. After all, his current strength was different from before. Regardless of whether it was his strength or soul, they couldn't be compared to the past. Rumble. As soon as Yi Xian slashed down with his sword, he and the black-robed man He Yen instantly retreated explosively for over 30 kilometers. At the instant that Yi Xian retreated, a flying sword suddenly slashed towards He Yen. He Yen didn't attack, but the heart saber in front of him suddenly swept out. Bang! The flying sword was slashed into pieces. But right at this moment Yi Xian suddenly appeared in front of He Yen. This time he didn't utilize a flying sword, and he directly utilized the core sword domain. In an instant, an expanse of sword light drowned He Yen, and countless rays of sword light tore and slashed apart. In the distance, the white-robed man in the lead frowned slightly. However, he still didn't attack. Right at this moment, Yi Xian's sword light suddenly exploded. Meanwhile, Yi Xian had already retreated over 3 kilometers. However, as he retreated, numerous flying swords connected from head to tail and slashed towards He Yan in the distance. 7 consecutive swords. In the distance, He Yan, who was covered in injuries, suddenly roared furiously. In the next moment, he held the heart saber with both hands as he charged forward and slashed forward. Remove the absurd. As soon as he spoke, a black dot suddenly appeared on the tip of the heart saber. This black dot seemed like black blood, and it was strange and ghastly. As soon as this black dot appeared, the heart saber suddenly trembled violently. In the next moment, an extremely terrifying force swept out from the tip of the heart saber. Bang! The first sword shattered and then the second. In the blink of an eye, the 7 swords were directly shattered by the saber. Not only that, but Yi Xian was directly pushed back tens of thousands of feet by the saber, and in front of him in the black flame was a huge space-time abyss that was thousands of feet wide. This spatial abyss was 300 m wide and 30 kilometers long. This was the result of He Yan's forceful slash. Moreover, a powerful force was ceaselessly shattering space within this spatial abyss. In the distance, He Yan held the heart saber in his right hand while the blood within his body boiled madly. At this moment, the blood that flowed out of his body was actually black. In the distance, Yi Xian wiped the blood from the corners of his mouth, and then he said, "The power of bloodline?" He Yan held the heart saber in his hand as he walked slowly towards Yi Xian. The bloodline of the fire god. Swordsman, you should be honored to die before the power of bloodline. P.S. Everyone, are you done playing daddy for today? If you are, get it? Chapter 2056. Infernal God Bloodline. It has to be said that after He Yan displayed the power of his bloodline, his strength had multiplied in a short period of time. Not only that, there was also a faint black flame around He Yan. The flame was like black blood, emitting an extremely terrifying power. The space around him was constantly being burned by the flame. It was extremely terrifying. At this moment, He Yan's blade was supported by the power of his bloodline. Yi Xian could no longer block it. From afar, Yi Xian looked at He Yan and sighed. Seeing Yi Xian sigh, He Yan stopped and frowned. "Swordsman, why are you sighing?" Yi Xian shook his head and smiled. "I just want to have a fair fight with you." He Yan stared at Yi Xian and was a little confused. "Swordsman, aren't we having a fair fight? My brothers didn't help me." Yi Xian smiled. "That's not what I meant." He Yan looked at the Qingxian sword in Yi Xian's hand and said, "I know that your sword is not ordinary. You can use it." Yi Xian looked at the Qingxian sword on his waist and shook his head. "Not really." Finishing his words, he slowly walked towards He Yan. He Yan squinted his eyes and was a little more cautious. He had never underestimated Yi Xian, the swordsman. One had to know that he had always been suppressed by Yi Xian before he used the power of his bloodline. Who knew if Yi Xian had a trump card? He Yan was secretly cautious. At the same time, the blade in his hand trembled slightly. A powerful force gathered in the blade and was ready to be unleashed. At this moment, Yi Xian's eyes gradually turned blood red. The next moment, he gently pushed with his left thumb. Swoosh! A blood-red sword light flashed across the field. The power of his bloodline. Yi Xian was not pedantic. Others had already used their bloodline power, so of course he would use it. His principle was that if you don't use external objects, I won't use external objects. If you don't use your father, I won't use my father. The moment the sword light appeared, the man in white and the woman in purple frowned at the same time. Opposite Yi Xian, He Yan's pupils abruptly shrunk. At this moment he could feel the aura of death. Moreover, as the blood sword approached, the aura of death grew increasingly dense. It had been a long time since he had felt the scent of death so close to his heart. He Yan did not choose to retreat, nor could he retreat. Because once he retreated, he would be crazily suppressed by Yi Xian's flying sword, and he would be in a passive position again. He Yan's right hand gripped the heart saber tightly. In an instant, his heart saber turned blood black. In the next moment, he held the saber with both hands and slashed forward. Breaking absurd. The saber fell. Boom. A saber light and a blood-red sword light suddenly exploded. The starry sky boiled. He Yan retreated tens of thousands of feet. The moment he stopped, his pupils abruptly shrunk. Because another sword was slashing towards him. He Yan forcefully swallowed the blood that had surged up his throat. Then he used his trembling hands to slash forward with the heart saber. Boom. The moment the saber fell, He Yan retreated tens of thousands of feet again. When he stopped, another sword slashed towards him. He Yan's pupils instantly shrunk to the size of a needle. He was about to attack, but he was shocked to find that the heart saber in his hands had shattered. It's over. At this moment, that was the only thought left in He Yan's mind. At this moment, when Yi Xian's sword was half an inch away from He Yan's forehead, it suddenly shattered and turned into nothingness. What replaced it was an arrow. The man in white had attacked. In the distance, Yi Xian turned to look at the man in white. The man in white had a calm expression. The competition is over. As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly took out a golden arrow. In the next moment he drew his bow and released the arrow. In the distance, Yi Xian gently lifted his thumb. The sword was unsheathed. Boom. A wave of sword light shattered, and Yi Xian's sword was directly shattered. In the next moment the arrow was already in front of Yi Xian. Yi Xian frowned slightly. He tilted his body slightly and easily dodged the arrow because it wasn't very fast. However, in the next moment, his pupils suddenly constricted because he realized that the arrow had appeared in front of him again. A strange arrow. Yi Xian reacted quickly and lightly lifted his thumb. The sword in the scabbard suddenly flew out and pierced the arrow. Boom. The golden arrow was directly blasted away. At this moment, another arrow arrived. Not only that, but a spear suddenly appeared behind Yi Xian's head. The appearance of this spear was truly strange. It only appeared a few inches behind Yi Xian's head before Yi Xian could sense this spear. An arrow and a spear. The woman in purple had attacked as well. At this moment Yi Xian's expression instantly became extremely solemn. A hopeless situation. At this moment he was directly in a hopeless situation. Because between the arrow and the spear, he could only choose to defend. And he knew that behind that arrow there was another arrow. His current situation was similar to He Yan's. In the end Yi Xian chose to defend against that arrow. He had no other choice. The sword was unsheathed. Boom. The golden arrow was directly blocked by his sword. However, Yi Xian was stunned because he realized that the spear hadn't pierced the back of his head. A mysterious force had blocked the spear. At this moment, a man appeared 300 meters behind Yi Xian. It was the Defying Ones. At this moment his right arm had recovered, and the injuries on his body had mostly healed. The Defying Ones raised his right hand and the tip of the spear turned in a strange way. In the next moment, it directly appeared in front of the woman in purple. The power of the Defying Ones. In the distance, the woman in purple's expression was calm. She raised her right hand lightly and then clenched it lightly. This time, the terrifying spear directly fell into her hand. Boom. The space around the woman in purple was directly annihilated at this moment, but she didn't retreat at all. Her expression was still calm. She had withstood the Defying One's power, but the space around her couldn't. The Defying Ones glanced at the woman in purple, and then appeared beside Yi Xian. "Brother Yi, are you all right?" Yi Xian shook his head and smiled. "These three fellows don't care about martial ethics. They actually ganged up on me." The Defying Ones said indifferently, "Not only did they ganged up on me but they also launched a sneak attack on me. They are even more shameless than you." Yi Xian turned to look at the Defying Ones, his face full of shock. "Are you targeting them? Why do I feel that you are targeting me?" The Defying Ones said seriously, "You are shameless but you have a bottom line. They are shameless without a bottom line. There is still a difference." Yi Xian's face was full of black lines. The Defying Ones still wanted to say something, but Yi Xian hurriedly said, "Stop, let's not discuss this topic anymore." The Defying Ones. Yi Xian looked at the man in white and the other two in the distance. "Who are they?" The Defying One shook his head. "I don't know." Yi Xian frowned. "You don't know?" The Defying Ones nodded. "I don't know where they came from. In any case, when I was fighting with Tianqin, these three fellows suddenly appeared and launched a sneak attack on me. If I hadn't run away quickly, I would have been dead." Yi Xian looked at the man in white and smiled. "You guys were recruited by Daybreak City." The man in white nodded. "Yes." Yi Xian frowned. "You guys are from Daybreak City?" The man in white shook his head. "No, we just took someone's money so we are helping them out." Hearing this, Yi Xian and the Defying Ones understood. Damn. These three people were hired by Daybreak City. Yi Xian glanced at the Defying Ones. "Looks like Daybreak City is up to something big." The Defying Ones spoke in a low voice. "We have to go back." Yi Xian looked at the man in white and the other two. "Will they let us go?" The Defying Ones hesitated for a moment and then he said, "Brother Yi, I know you're very good at fighting. Why don't you stop them while I go back first? I'll bring some people over to save you once I return." Yi Xian smiled. "You'll bring some people over to collect my corpse after you return, right?" The Defying One's expression froze when he heard this. Yi Xian shook his head. Even though he was confident, it was absolutely impossible for him to fight 3 people at once, even if he used the green profound sword and his bloodline energy. The man in white strength was absolutely not inferior to him, the Defying Ones and the woman in a violet dress. They were extremely strong, but He Yan wasn't weak either. Not to mention 1 against 3, even 2 against 3 would be quite difficult for them. In the distance, the man in white glanced at Yi Xian. Our target is him. We won't stop you if you leave. Yi Xian asked hurriedly, really? Fuck. The Defying Ones looked at Yi Xian. Brother Yi, don't scare me. If Yi Xian left, then he would be beaten up, and he had already been beaten up just now. In the distance, the man in white nodded. Really? Yi Xian was slightly hesitant. The Defying One's expression changed drastically. Brother Yi, tell me that you're not that kind of person. Yi Xian looked at the Defying Ones. Look, you're their target, so it's really inexcusable for me to stay. The Defying Ones hurriedly said, What inexcusable? We're on the same side. We're brothers from the same sect, and blood is thicker than water. Yi Xian said seriously, You shot my star vein in the past. Have you forgotten? The Defying Ones was stunned, and then he said, Brother Yi, that doesn't seem to be yours, right? I remember it's the Imperial God. Saying this, he suddenly took out a storage ring and put it in front of Yi Xian, who was about to leave, and then said, Brother Yi, it was a misunderstanding, a misunderstanding. I have no use for this star vein. You keep it. Yi Xian took the storage ring, and then he flew into a rage. What are you doing? The Defying Ones was stunned. Yi Xian said angrily, We're all from Eternal Night City. We should be in the same boat, but you gave me this thing. You're insulting me, don't you know that? The Defying One's expression froze. Yi Xian said bitterly, We're brothers from the same sect, and blood is thicker than water. You actually used the star vein to measure our friendship. What kind of person do you think I, Yi Xian, am? I look down on you. I look down on you. The Defying Ones looked at Yi Xian dumbfounded. Brother, are you on the same side as them, Yi Xian? Chapter 2057. The man in white said abruptly, It seems like you intend to interfere in this matter. Yi Xian looked at the man in white and smiled. This is my brother from the same sect, yet you're asking me to leave him alone? That won't do unless you pay me more. The Defying One's expression froze when he heard Yi Xian, and he tugged on Yi Xian's sleeve. Brother Yi, don't be like this. I'm panicking. He really was panicking. If Yi Xian didn't do anything, he would definitely die. He couldn't fight the 3 of them on his own. The man in white gazed at Yi Xian, and he said after a short while, It's impossible to pay more. However, I can bury all of you together later. As soon as he finished speaking, the bow was drawn and the arrow was released. Everywhere the arrow passed, space and time started burning, and then it was swiftly obliterated. In the distance, Yi Xian's eyes narrowed slightly, and there was a trace of a solemn expression in his eyes. He raised his left thumb, and the sword in the sheath flew out. At this moment, he'd utilized the power of his bloodline, so this attack didn't just contain sword aura and sword aura, it also contained the power of his bloodline. Everywhere the blood-red sword passed, space and time were obliterated into nothingness. Bang! The golden feathered arrow was stopped by this strike. At this moment, a spear pierced straight down from the top of Yi Xian's head. When the spear was only a dozen inches away from Yi Xian's head, a mysterious force suddenly enveloped the spear. In the next moment, the spear vanished on the spot, and when it reappeared, it was already above the head of the woman in the purple dress in the distance. Not only that, the force contained within it was many times stronger than before. The purple-robed woman frowned slightly. She opened her palm and gently pushed upwards. In an instant, an invisible force blocked the spear. However, the deceived space-time above her head caved in like the bottom of a pot. It was extremely terrifying. Meanwhile, the Defying One suddenly pressed his right hand down. Bang! The spear above the woman in a purple dress suddenly trembled violently, and a powerful force passed through it and smashed down. Rumble. The space where the woman resided had transformed into a strange vortex. However, right at this moment, she waved her right hand lightly, and then a violet barrier of light enveloped her. She was safe and sound within the violet barrier of light. Not only that, but the powerful retrograde force actually dissipated little by little when it came into contact with the purple light barrier. Seeing this, the Defying Ones in the distance frowned slightly and slowly clenched their right hands. Right at this moment, the woman in the purple dress made a grabbing motion with her right hand, and this grab directly grabbed onto the spear. In the next moment she vanished on the spot. In practically an instant, the space in front of the defying adversary was suddenly torn apart. A spear tore through the air, and then it pierced towards the space between the defying adversary's eyebrows at lightning speed. The defying walker's expression was calm. He clenched his right hand tightly into a fist, and then he suddenly punched forward. A strand of formidable defying energy swept out from his fist, and in an instant he and the woman in a purple dress had actually switched places. Reverse spacetime. Boom. The expanse of space in front of the woman in a purple dress had been pierced into an enormous spatial black hole. Meanwhile, she suddenly turned around and stabbed her spear forward again. However, the defying walker had switched places with her once more. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't turn around and she just stabbed her spear forward instead. Bang! An expanse of violet light suddenly erupted from the tip of the spear. Rumble. In an instant, the entire starry sky seethed while countless strands of starlight were obliterated. Meanwhile, the defying walker had transformed into countless afterimages that retreated backwards. He turned into countless afterimages as he retreated. When he stopped, the countless afterimages returned to his body, and the woman in the purple dress had already retreated 100,000 feet. She gazed at the defying walker in the distance, and then she vanished on the spot. The defying walker took a step forward and he vanished as well. In an instant, countless afterimages appeared in that expanse of space. Yi Xian withdrew his gaze and gazed at the white-clothed man in front of him. If it was a one-on-one battle, then the defying walker wouldn't lose to the woman in a purple dress at all. Of course he wouldn't lose to the white-clothed man as well. However, the problem was that it wasn't a fair competition. It was a 3 against 2. That was disadvantageous to him and the defying walker. In the distance, the white-clothed man suddenly took out a black feathered arrow. But right at this moment Yi Xian suddenly flicked his thumb, and a flying sword slashed out. Of course he wouldn't just stand there and wait for his opponent to attack. What was the biggest disadvantage of an archer? They were afraid of getting close to him. He wanted to strike first and gain the upper hand. However, his sword pierced through thin air. Because when the green profound sword slashed towards the white-clothed man took a small step to the left, and it was this small step that caused Yi Xian's sword to miss. Not only that, but a black feathered arrow had already arrived in front of Yi Xian. Yi Xian lightly flicked his left thumb. Bang! A wave of sword light suddenly erupted in front of him, and Yi Xian instantly retreated a few kilometers away. But he hadn't even stopped when that black feathered arrow came again. It was still that black feathered arrow. Yi Xian's eyes narrowed slightly, and then he slowly closed his eyes. At this moment, the heavens and the earth suddenly fell silent. His heart was calm. He'd entered such a state when he fought He Yan earlier, and the might of his sword when he attacked in such a state was much stronger. Everything was clear when the heart was calm. Even though his eyes were closed, he was able to clearly sense everything about the arrow, and it even included the trembling of the feathers at the end of the arrow. Suddenly Yi Xian lightly flicked his thumb. Boom! A clear and melodious sword howl suddenly resounded. In the next moment, a ray of light slashed against the arrow. Bang! The arrow was forcefully stopped, but it didn't move back. But this time Yi Xian's sword didn't move back as well. The sword and arrow were in a stalemate, but the space around them was gradually being obliterated. The force of the sword and arrow had stopped. However, the space in the surroundings wasn't able to endure it. Right at this moment, the white-clothed man took out another black feathered arrow, and then a sharp tearing sound resounded. In the distance, Yi Xian's expression was calm, and his thumb was on the hilt of his sword. When the arrow was a few meters away from him, he lightly flicked his thumb, and the sword in the sheath flew out. This sword was different from before. When it left the sheath, it was very calm and it carried a sense of ease. This sword slashed against the arrow, and the arrow trembled violently before it was blasted 3 kilometers away. The white-clothed man frowned slightly when he saw this, and there was a trace of seriousness in the depths of his eyes as he looked at Yi Xian. Change. Since the beginning of the battle, Yi Xian's sword had been slowly changing, and it was a sign of a breakthrough. When he thought of this, the white-clothed man turned to look at He Yan. Are we here to make friends with them? He Yan was stunned, and then he shook his head. Of course not. The white-clothed man said, Since you're not, then why aren't you attacking? He Yan's expression froze. He hesitated for a while and then raised his hand. He raised his long saber and charged towards Yi Xian. In the distance, Yi Xian frowned slightly. He was not afraid of He Yan. However, when He Yan charged towards him, another black arrow shot towards him. This arrow was different from the previous one. Everything in its path became illusory. Arrows. Off in the distance, Yi Xian frowned slightly. At this moment he was a bit irritated, or perhaps it could be said that he was a bit anxious. Anxious would make him irritated, and irritated would make him unable to calm his heart. Very quickly Yi Xian felt that his state of mind had changed. He was shocked. If he became agitated at this moment, it would be very dangerous. The man in white and He Yan were not ordinary people. At this time, it was already too late for him to change his state of mind. He gently pushed with his thumb. The sword was unsheathed. However, the power of this sword was much weaker than the previous one. When this sword touched the arrow, it was instantly destroyed. The arrow continued forward, piercing towards Yi Xian. At the same time, He Yan's saber was already above Yi Xian's head. Yi Xian suddenly unsheathed his sword and slashed. This was because He Yan was already in front of him. This was a close combat. If the flying sword could not directly destroy the opponent's power, then he would be the one at a disadvantage. Unsheathing the sword to determine life and death. As soon as the sword was unsheathed, a ray of sword light suddenly exploded in front of him. In an instant, the ray of sword light engulfed both of them. In the next moment, both of them retreated at the same time. Yi Xian retreated tens of thousands of feet. Not only that, there was a black arrow stuck in his left chest. The black arrow trembled slightly, crazily destroying the vitality in Yi Xian's body. However, at this crucial moment, the power of the bloodline in Yi Xian's body suddenly surged. Then, the power of the bloodline crazily resisted the power of the black arrow. Yi Xian was stunned. He did not expect his bloodline to have such a function. Without much thought, Yi Xian was about to pull the arrow out, but he was shocked to find that he could not pull it out at all. Yi Xian tried to use his aura and sword force to force it out, but it did not work. Just like that, the power of his bloodline and the power of the arrow crazily fought against each other in his body. In the distance, the man in white suddenly took out another black arrow. He looked at Yi Xian. I know that the sword in your hand is not simple. Are you really not going to use it? Obviously he was referring to the green profound sword. Yi Xian looked at the man in white and said disdainfully, I don't care about external objects. The man in white looked at Yi Xian and nodded, You've got guts. As he spoke, he shot another arrow. Almost at the same time, He Yan appeared in front of Yi Xian again. He was faster than the arrow. Obviously this was intentional. He was covering for the man in white's arrow. At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly pulled out his sword and slashed. This time he did not use an ordinary sword, but the green profound sword. This sword slashed out. Boom. A ray of light shattered and He Yan was directly sent flying. This time he flew for tens of thousands of feet. When he stopped, his body was gone. Not only that, the arrow was directly shattered by Yi Xian's sword. In the distance, the man in white squinted his eyes. Behind him, the purple arrow in the quiver suddenly trembled. On the other side, He Yan looked at Yi Xian and said blankly, Didn't you say you don't need it? Yi Xian looked at He Yan and said seriously, I lied to you. Are you angry? He Yan's expression froze. P.S. Asking for tickets. I exploded yesterday. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.